My name is Aria, and I am 29 years old. Just 3 days ago, my parents deliberately hid my grandmother's death from me until after they put her in the ground. They told me they forgot to text me the schedule, but the truth was they just did not want me there. Less than 24 hours later, they threw a catered party to celebrate inheriting her estate. They were raising glasses of wine in her living room, bragging about their new wealth. Then the doorbell rang. When my grandmother's estate attorney stepped into the foyer and pulled the revised trust from his leather briefcase, my mother's face went chalk white. My grandmother had secretly bypassed them both, leaving me her entire fortune and the deed to the exact house my parents were currently standing in. Before I tell you what that lawyer read to the room, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Olivia Stories Revenge, but only if you genuinely enjoy stories about family boundaries. Drop a comment, letting me know how old you are, where you are watching from, and what time it is there right now. Now let me take you back to how I found out standing in the suffocating heat of a Maryland summer. The August heat in Maryland does not just sit on you, it wraps around your throat. I stood outside the wrought iron gates of the Annapolis Cemetery, breathing in the smell of cut grass and polished granite, but all I could taste was the marsh muck drying on my skin. I was still wearing my neoprene chest waders caked to the knee, with Severn River clay from tracking dead zones all morning. My phone felt heavy in my hand. The screen was cracked in the top left corner, but the image glowing across the display was razor sharp. It was my sister Harper. She was posed under the shade of an old oak tree wearing a tailored black sheath dress and oversized Dior sunglasses. She had angled the camera perfectly to capture the solemn slope of a granite headstone in the background. The caption posted 3 hours ago, "Read saying goodbye to our beloved matriarch." I stared at the words until the letters blurred. Saying goodbye. My boots left thick, dark clumps of river mud on the manicured walking path as I shoved past the gates. I ignored the groundskeeper watching me. I jogged through rows of silent stones, my breath tearing at my chest, scanning the vast green lawns for the family plot. I found it near the eastern edge. The burial was over. There was no tent, no folding chairs, no priest. Just a rectangular mound of freshly turned earth, dark and stark against the bright green sod, topped with a few overpriced floral wreaths already wilting in the brutal midday sun. I dropped to my knees right at the edge of the plot. The damp soil soaked through my jeans where the waders ended. Grandma Helen was down there, the only person in my family who looked at me and saw a person instead of a disappointment, and they had put her in the ground without me. I pulled up my mother's contact and hit call. My fingers shook so hard I almost dropped the device into the dirt. It rang 4 times. Diane finally picked up. In the background, I could hear the faint, rhythmic clinking of silverware and the low hum of a dozen overlapping conversations. Not the hushed tones of a wake, the lively buzz of a cocktail hour. Aria Diane sighed. The annoyance in her voice was crisp and immediate. "If this is about the electric bill again, your father already handled it." "You buried her," I choked out. The air in my lungs felt like broken glass. A beat of silence. The clinking in the background continued. "I told Harper to text you the updated schedule," Diane said, her tone shifting to a breezy, impenetrable defense. "The funeral home moved the service up due to the heat. We assumed you were out on some boat. You know how unreliable your cell reception is on the water." "It is my grandmother, Mom," I shrieked. My voice cracked raw and high-pitched, echoing across the empty cemetery. "You do not just change the time and shrug. You did not even try to call." "There is no need for hysterics." Diane clipped, her voice dropping into a harsh, tight whisper. "This is exactly why we did not press the issue. You turn everything into a spectacle. We wanted a dignified send-off for Helen, not one of your emotional outbursts." The line went dead. She hung up on me. I did not throw the phone. I did not deliver a stoic, calculated vow of revenge to the open air. I just folded forward, pressing my forehead against the rough, fragrant dirt of the grave, and wept. It was a messy, humiliating breakdown. Snot ran down my chin. My shoulders heaved as I gasped for air, digging my raw, calloused fingers into the loose soil until dirt packed under my nails. I felt stripped bare. Have you ever discovered a devastating family secret through a casual social media post? How do you even begin to process that level of calculated exclusion? I knelt there in the mud for 20 minutes. When I finally stood up, the agonizing grief sitting heavy in my chest had begun to curdle. It hardened, cooling into a sharp, blinding rage. I wiped my face with the back of my dirty sleeve, leaving a streak of river clay across my cheek. I turned my back on the grave and marched toward my battered Subaru. I knew exactly where they were gathering. The drive down Route 50 felt like navigating through a blur. My Subaru rattled as I pushed the engine past the speed limit, heading toward the historic district of Annapolis. The air conditioning in my car broke 3 summers ago. The humid Maryland wind whipped through the open windows, tangling my hair into a salty knot, but I barely registered the heat. My knuckles gripped the steering wheel tight enough to make my joints throb. All I could see in my mind was that dark patch of fresh dirt. My mother grew up on the eastern shore, spending her childhood packing blue crabs on old newspaper just to afford dinner. That kind of grinding poverty leaves deep scars on a person. For Diane, wealth was not merely a luxury to be enjoyed. It was a heavy armor she wore to ensure she never had to smell low tide or worry about a bank loan ever again. She spent her entire adult life running from her roots, building a pristine socialite image that required constant funding. My father, Richard, was a mid-level bank executive who preferred the quiet deck of his sailboat over any form of emotional conflict. He funded Diane's expensive armor and enabled her every cruelty, deciding long ago that keeping his wife happy was much easier than protecting his eldest daughter. He viewed my emotions as a nuisance, something messy that disrupted his peaceful weekends. The wrought iron gates of their sprawling colonial estate stood wide open when I arrived. I pulled my muddy hatchback directly between a pristine black Lexus and a silver Mercedes-Benz parked in the circular driveway. The front doors were propped open to let the coastal breeze flow through the grand foyer. I expected to walk into the heavy quiet of a grieving house. Instead, I heard upbeat jazz music spilling from the living room. I stepped through the grand entrance. A waiter in a crisp black vest walked past me, carrying a silver tray piled high with Maryland crab balls and miniature crab cakes. This was not a mourning period. This was a high society networking event disguised as a celebration of life. I did not stop to take off my neoprene waders. I marched straight into the formal living room. My heavy work boots left dark, thick tracks of Severn River clay across the imported white Persian rugs. I was tracking the messy reality of the bay straight into my mother's sterilized world. About 30 guests mingled near the marble fireplace. Harper stood near the patio doors, holding a glass of champagne. My younger sister was an aspiring real estate agent who spent more time curating her wealthy lifestyle on social media than actually selling houses in the Annapolis area. Her designer clothes were funded by a mountain of credit card debt she kept desperately hidden from her peers. She used our parents as a financial shield whenever reality threatened to catch up with her. Right in the center of the room was Diane. She wore a tailored black dress that looked more suited for a charity gala than a funeral repast. She held a glass of Pinot Grigio, laughing softly with a group of country club wives. It was just so exhausting, Diane was saying to a woman in a pastel blazer. Helen declined so quickly toward the end. Harper and I simply had to take those few weeks in the Outer Banks last month just to recover our own mental health. We needed the beach to heal before the end came. The words hit my ears, and a raw wave of anger swallowed whatever restraint I had left. I shoved past a waiter, sending a tray of empty glasses clattering against a mahogany side table. The sharp noise cut the jazz music in half. Conversations halted abruptly. 30 pairs of eyes turned toward the doorway to look at the woman covered in mud. "How can you stand there drinking wine?" I yelled, my voice ragged and echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Her dirt is still wet. You buried my grandmother 3 hours ago, and you are throwing a cocktail party." The color drained from Diane's face. She set her wine glass down on the mantel with a sharp click. Before she could formulate a response, Richard appeared from the hallway. He darted toward me, grabbing my upper arm. His grip was tight, desperate to contain the scene and restore order to his house. "Aria, lower your voice right now," my father hissed through clenched teeth, pulling me toward the foyer. "You are embarrassing us in front of these people. Look at yourself. You are tracking mud everywhere. I ripped my arm out of his grasp. I did not deliver a calm, composed speech. I just broke. My chest heaved as I sobbed in front of the wealthy strangers. I did not care about the mud or the stairs or the ruined rugs. I just wanted my grandmother back. Why did you not let me say goodbye? I cried, the tears spilling hot down my face, mixing with the dirt on my cheeks. I loved her. She was my grandmother. Why did you hide the funeral from me? Diane stepped forward, smoothing the front of her dress. The faux sympathy she had been performing for her guests vanished, replaced by a cold, rigid pragmatism. We did not hide it, she said, her tone dripping with disdain. We simply chose not to invite a spectacle. And looking at you now screaming and covered in swamp water, I made the right decision. Helen is gone, Aria. Crying over a grave does not change that. What changes things is the estate. Harper drifted to her mother's side, crossing her arms defensively. She left us everything, Aria. Harper added, her voice carrying a smug edge. Mom said the inheritance is finally going to clear out my business loans. We can actually secure our status instead of pretending. You just want to ruin this for us because Grandma always liked your weird hobbies better. I stared at the three of them. My family. They had locked me out of the final goodbye just so they could fast-track their path to the bank. They stood united, a wall of greed and designer clothing waiting for me to leave. My father looked at the floor, unable to hold a steady gaze with me. He was choosing the path of least resistance, just like he always did. The unfairness of it choked me. I opened my mouth to argue, to plead, to demand some shred of decency, but I had no words left. The heavy quiet in the room stretched suffocating and thick. Then the heavy brass knocker on the front door sounded. The dull thud echoed through the tense foyer. The caterers froze in place. My father cleared his throat, adjusting his collar as he walked to the entryway and pulled the door open. A man stood on the porch, framed by the fading afternoon light. He was in his early 60s, wearing a charcoal gray suit that looked expensive but highly practical. He held a thick, worn leather briefcase by his side. His silver hair was combed neatly, and wire-rimmed glasses sat precisely on the bridge of his nose. Richard forced a polite, welcoming smile onto his face. "Harrison," he greeted the man, stepping aside to clear the path. "We were just hosting a small gathering for Helen's friends. Please come in. Can I get you a drink? A glass of wine or some bourbon?" Harrison Belmont. Helen's meticulous estate attorney stepped past the threshold. He did not smile. He did not acknowledge the outstretched hand my father offered. He stopped at the edge of the foyer, looking down at the muddy tracks my boots had left, and then lifted his gaze to sweep across the room full of guests holding champagne flutes. His expression held a profound, dry disdain. He turned his attention directly to my mother. "I will not be having a drink," Richard Belmont said. His voice was firm, carrying a weight that immediately sucked the remaining air out of the room. "I suggest you ask your guests to leave right now. I am here to execute Helen's living trust and read the will. And given the specific terms she laid out, you will want this to be a private family matter." The guests did not need to be told twice. Harrison Belmont possessed a specific kind of quiet authority that commanded obedience without ever raising its volume. Within minutes, the 30 wealthy acquaintances my mother had gathered began setting their crystal champagne flutes down on various side tables. They offered awkward, murmured condolences and shuffled toward the front door. The lively jazz music playing through the hidden ceiling speakers suddenly sounded hollow and absurd. My father stood by the entryway, offering tight, forced smiles as he ushered the last of the local politicians and country club wives out onto the driveway. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut, sealing the five of us inside the sudden, suffocating quiet of the foyer. Diane turned around. The gracious hostess routine vanished instantly. Her shoulders stiffened, and her jaw locked. She did not like being told what to do in her own home, especially in front of her social circle. She crossed her arms, her manicured fingers tapping against her elbows. "Harrison." "That was entirely unnecessary," Diane said. Her voice was sharp and brittle. "We were celebrating my mother. You could have scheduled an appointment at your office for next week like a normal professional. There is no reason to barge in here and create a scene." Belmont did not react to her scolding. He walked past her and headed straight for the formal dining room. "I suggest we all sit down," he stated without turning back. We followed him. I kept my distance, my boots squelching slightly against the hardwood floors. I stood near the edge of the dining room while my parents took their usual seats. Richard sat at the head of the long, polished table. Diane sat to his immediate right, smoothing her black designer dress. Harper dropped into the chair next to her mother, pulling out her phone to check her notifications. She looked bored, treating the reading of her grandmother's will like a tedious mandatory staff meeting she had to endure before she could get her inheritance. Belmont placed his worn leather briefcase on the gleaming table. The heavy brass clasps echoed with a loud snap as he opened it. He pulled out a thick stack of documents bound in a blue legal folder and a pair of reading glasses, which he carefully hooked over his ears. "Let us dispense with the pleasantries," Belmont began. He folded his hands over the blue cover. "Helen established a revocable living trust 5 years ago. I am sure you are aware of this, Diane, as you have called my office asking for details regarding the inventory on a near-monthly basis." Diane offered a thin, smug smile. She reached up to adjust the pearl necklace resting against her collarbone. "My mother was a very smart woman," she replied. "She knew the probate process in Maryland takes far too long. A living trust avoids the courts and keeps our private assets away from public record. We are fully prepared to assume control of the accounts today." Harper put her phone face down on the table and leaned forward. She needed this money. She projected the image of a top-tier Annapolis real estate agent, posting photos of luxury listings and expensive brunches, but she had not closed a meaningful sale in 8 months. The $60,000 of hidden credit card debt was a ticking bomb waiting to destroy her curated life. Belmont adjusted his glasses. He looked down at the paperwork. "You are correct about the mechanism, Diane. However, upon Helen passing 3 days ago, the revocable living trust converted into an irrevocable trust. The terms are now permanent and legally binding." "Get on with it, Harrison." My father sighed, rubbing his temples as if this were just another banking meeting running past schedule. "We all know how a trust works. Read the disbursement schedule so we can move forward." Belmont cleared his throat. "As the designated executor and managing attorney, it is my duty to inform you of the settler's final wishes." He looked up, his gaze fixing directly on my mother. "Helen Margaret bypassed you entirely, Diane." The dining room went very still. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway suddenly sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. Diane blinked. Her smug smile froze, then slowly dissolved. "What did you just say?" "The trust bypasses you." Belmont repeated, his tone devoid of any emotion. "It also bypasses Richard and Harper. Helen explicitly directed that no portion of her liquid assets, her investment portfolios, or her real property shall be distributed to anyone in this immediate family circle, save for one individual." Belmont turned a page, the crisp paper rustling in the silence. He read the next paragraph aloud. "I designate my granddaughter Aria as the sole beneficiary and the sole acting trustee of this estate. She is granted total legal authority over all financial accounts, stock options, and safe deposit boxes held in my name." Harper let out a strange wheezing sound. She grabbed the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. "But I need that," Harper gasped, her chest heaving as a full-blown panic attack began to seize her lungs. "Mom said I was getting my share today. Mom promised me." Diane ignored her youngest daughter. She pushed her chair back and stood up, her face draining of all color. The polished Annapolis socialite disappeared, replaced by the terrified, frantic woman from the Eastern Shore who lived in mortal fear of losing everything. "That is a lie," Diane shrieked. Her voice echoed off the crystal chandelier above us. "You are lying. My mother would never do that. I am her only child. She knew I needed that security. You forged this document." "I did no such thing," Belmont countered smoothly. "I have the medical evaluations Helen submitted the day she finalized these terms. She was of sound mind. Furthermore, there is the matter of the primary real estate asset." Belmont reached into his blue folder and produced a single sheet of paper with a raised county seal. He slid it across the mahogany table until it stopped right in front of my father. "This is the certified deed to this property," Belmont said. Helen owned this estate free and clear. It was held within the trust. As of 3 days ago, the title transferred. Aria is now the sole legal owner of the house you are currently sitting in. Richard stared at the deed as if it were a venomous snake. The blood rushed to his face. He looked at me standing in the corner in my muddy waders, then back to the paper. Diane lost whatever shred of control she had left. She slammed her hands down on the table. She looked around the room, her eyes wild, searching for something to destroy. Her gaze landed on the coffee table in the adjacent sitting room. Resting on top of a stack of glossy architectural magazines was a battered paperback copy of Silent Spring. It was the book Helen and I used to read together when she asked me to explain my wetland ecology research. Helen hated Diane's superficial magazines and left the book there as a quiet rebellion. Diane lunged toward the sitting room. She swiped her arm across the coffee table, sending the magazines and the paperback flying across the room. She screamed that it was all trash, that Helen was a spiteful old woman, and that I must have brainwashed her. I did not feel a rush of triumph. I did not feel like a powerful heir claiming her rightful throne. I felt like a scared little girl. The screaming triggered a deep, ingrained trauma response. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. My vision tunneled. I scrambled across the floor, dropping to my knees to grab the battered copy of Silent Spring. I clutched the paperback to my chest, dirt from my clothes smudging the cover. "Aria, fix this right now?" Richard yelled at me, his voice booming with the authority he used to force compliance. "Tell him this is a mistake." Diane was hyperventilating, pacing the floor, her hands tearing at her perfectly styled hair. She pointed a shaking finger at me, screaming that I was stealing their lives, that I was ruining the family, that I was a treacherous, ungrateful mistake. The noise was too much. The pressure was crushing my chest. I could not handle the wrath. I just wanted the yelling to stop. I wanted the terrifying anger directed at me to vanish. "Okay," I stammered. My voice was weak and trembling. "Mom, stop crying. Please stop screaming. I will split it. I will give you half the money. We can just divide it. Please just stop yelling at me." Belmont stepped forward, placing himself between me and my parents. He raised his hand in a sharp, commanding gesture, cutting off my father, who had just opened his mouth to accept the offer. "Do not say another word," Aria Belmont ordered. His tone was not unkind, but it left no room for debate. "You are experiencing extreme emotional duress. As the attorney representing this trust, I am advising you that any verbal promise you make in this room right now holds zero legal weight. You will not surrender your grandmother's legacy because you are frightened of a tantrum." Belmont reached down, clamped his hand firmly on my shoulder, and pulled me to my feet. He did not look at my parents again. He guided me toward the front door, keeping himself positioned as a physical shield. "We will discuss the logistics tomorrow morning at my office," Belmont said to me quietly as he opened the heavy front door. I stumbled out onto the front porch, clutching the paperback book against my chest like a shield. The humid air hit my face, offering a brief moment of clarity. As Belmont pulled the door shut behind us, the sound of Diane screaming obscenities echoed through the grand foyer, piercing the quiet, affluent street and trailing me all the way to my car. The panic did not subside when I woke up the next morning. It had calcified overnight into a heavy, cold block sitting right below my ribs. I drove to Harrison Belmont's law office in downtown Annapolis, desperately hoping that stepping into a professional environment would somehow make the chaos of the previous day feel manageable. I imagined walking out of his office with a certified check, a new set of house keys, and a clear path to simply walk away from my family forever. I thought the hard part was over. I was entirely wrong. The real nightmare was just beginning. Belmont's office was located in a restored brick building near the State House. It smelled like old paper lemon pledge and expensive coffee. I sat in a high-backed leather chair across from his massive oak desk. My fingernails dug into the armrests. I wore a clean pair of jeans and a plain gray sweater, feeling woefully underdressed in a room that screamed old money prestige. Belmont sat behind his desk reviewing a stack of paperwork. He removed his wire-rimmed glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked exhausted, carrying the demeanor of a man who had delivered bad news 1,000 times before. "I want to change the locks," I said. My voice sounded small and uncertain in the quiet room. "They have no right to be in Grandma Helen's house anymore. I want them out by the end of the week." Belmont let out a slow, measured breath. He folded his hands together, resting them on the polished wood. "Aria," he started gently, "you need to understand that the law does not operate on emotional timelines. You cannot simply go to a hardware store, buy a new deadbolt, and lock your parents out of that property." "Why not?" I asked, my heart rate picking up. "You showed them the deed. It is my house. The trust made me the owner." "It did," Belmont confirmed. "However, your parents have lived in that residence continuously for 20 years. Under Maryland property law, they have established clear tenancy rights. Even though there is no formal lease agreement, you are legally considered their landlord right now. You cannot execute a self-help eviction. If you change those locks, Diane will call the Anne Arundel County Police. They will arrest you for illegal eviction and force you to let them back inside." The color drained from my face. I stared at him, trying to process the absurdity of the situation. "You are telling me my mother gets to live in a multi-million-dollar waterfront mansion that she does not own, and I cannot stop her. You must follow the formal legal process," Belmont explained, his tone strictly clinical. "You have to serve them with a written 60-day notice to vacate. If they refuse to leave after 60 days, which I guarantee Diane will, you must file a complaint in the district court for wrongful detainer or tenant holding over. Then you wait for a hearing date. Then you wait for a judge to issue a warrant of restitution. Then you schedule the county sheriff to physically remove them." He leaned forward, holding my gaze. "Best case scenario. Aria, if the courts are moving quickly, you are looking at 3 to 4 months before they are forced out. During that entire period, they get to stay in the house." I felt dizzy. The room seemed to tilt slightly. "Okay," I whispered, trying to steady my breathing. "Okay, 3 or 4 months. I can wait. Just give me access to the liquid assets in the trust. I need to pay rent on my apartment. I need to hire a process server. I need the money Grandma left me so I can actually fight this." Belmont picked up a silver pen and tapped it softly against a legal pad. The sharp clicking sound set my teeth on edge. "That brings us to the second complication," he said. "A trust bypasses the standard probate court, which saves time," he continued. "But banks and investment firms require a rigorous administrative process before they release millions of dollars to a new trustee. We have to apply for a new employer identification number from the IRS for the Irrevocable Trust. We have to submit certified death certificates to 5 different financial institutions. Each bank has its own legal department that must review the trust documents to ensure they are not liable for releasing funds to the wrong party." He set the pen down. "In a perfect world where no one contests the transfer, it takes 30 to 45 days for those funds to clear administrative hurdles and become accessible to you." I stopped breathing. The cold block in my chest expanded, freezing my lungs. 30 to 45 days. Belmont pushed a printed spreadsheet across the desk. "This is the estimated operating cost of the Annapolis estate. Property taxes, insurance premiums, basic utilities, and mandatory maintenance. As the legal owner, you are now entirely responsible for these bills. If the property taxes go unpaid, the county will place a lien on the house. If the insurance lapses and a pipe bursts while Diane is living there, you are personally liable for the damages." I looked down at the spreadsheet. The monthly carrying cost of the estate was nearly $6,000. My take-home pay as a wetland ecologist working for a state conservation program was roughly $3,200 a month. My rent took half of that. My student loans took a quarter. I had barely $1,500 sitting in my checking account. "I cannot pay this," I gasped, pushing the paper back toward him as if it were on fire. "Mr. Belmont, I am broke. I drive a car with no air conditioning, and I buy generic brand groceries. I cannot float the taxes on a mansion for 2 months while I wait for a bank to clear the trust funds. I will go bankrupt before I ever see a dime." I slumped forward, burying my face in my hands. The humiliation was overwhelming. Grandma Helen had tried to hand me an empire, but she had actually strapped a massive financial anchor to my ankle and tossed me into the deep end. I felt like a failure. I was too poor to inherit her wealth. Tears of pure frustration leaked through my fingers. "I cannot do this," I sobbed, my voice muffled by my hands. "Diane wins. I do not have the resources to sustain a legal war. Just tell them they can have it. Let them keep the house. I just want to go back to my quiet life." Belmont did not offer platitudes. He did not hand me a tissue or tell me everything would magically work out. He waited until my sobbing subsided into ragged breaths. Then he spoke, his voice sharp enough to cut through my panic. "You are not surrendering, Aria. You are going to fight because Helen knew exactly what she was doing. She knew this would be difficult, but she trusted you to endure it." I wiped my eyes with the heel of my hand, looking up at him. How? How am I supposed to fight when I cannot even afford the battlefield? Belmont opened a second folder. "Diane called my office at 8 o'clock this morning. She did not call to negotiate. She informed me that she has formally retained Sterling and Vance, one of the most aggressive and expensive probate litigation firms in Maryland. They charge upwards of $600 an hour. She is officially contesting the trust." My stomach dropped. I could not even afford my own rent, and my mother was preparing to bury me in legal motions funded by her husband's bank executive salary. However, Belmont continued, a faint, grim smile finally touching the corners of his mouth. "Diane's arrogance has blinded her to a very specific nuance of Maryland probate law, because she is the one initiating a caveat to contest a trust that is presumed valid on its face. She carries the burden of proof." He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "If she loses this case, and I intend to make sure she does, the court can rule that her caveat was frivolous and filed in bad faith. Under those specific circumstances, the estate is permitted to hold the contesting party personally liable for the defending trustee's legal fees." I stared at him, the legal jargon slowly translating in my exhausted brain. "You mean Diane has to pay you?" Belmont nodded slowly. "Diane does not know this yet. Her overpriced lawyers likely buried that risk deep in a retainer agreement she did not bother to read because she is so blinded by her own greed. She believes she can simply outspend you and starve you into submission." A spark of something dangerous ignited in my chest. "Let her hire the most expensive sharks in Annapolis," Belmont said, his eyes glinting with a predatory legal satisfaction. "Let her gleefully rack up hundreds of billable hours, filing endless motions. She is blindly digging her own financial grave. Every dollar she spends trying to break you is a dollar she will ultimately owe this estate when we crush her petition in court." He slid a loan application across the desk. "My litigation partner works with a specific lending firm that provides bridge loans to trustees waiting on administrative clearance. The interest rate is high, but it will cover the property taxes and your initial retainer until the trust funds thaw." I looked at the loan document. It was a massive, terrifying risk. If I lost the case, I would be straddled with crippling debt for the rest of my life. But if I walked away, Diane would desecrate the only safe space my grandmother ever created. I grabbed the silver pen from the desk. My hand was still shaking, but I signed my name on the dotted line. "Strap in, Aria," Belmont warned, taking the document back. "This will not be resolved in days. It is going to be a grueling, brutal battle of attrition." I left his office with a mountain of debt and a target on my back. I walked out into the humid Annapolis morning, pulling my phone from my pocket. I had 5 missed calls and 12 unread messages. The legal war had officially started, but the true nightmare was the notification waiting at the top of my screen. It was a message from the Anne Arundel County court system. Diane had just fired her first shot. The knock on my apartment door came 3 days later at 6 in the morning. I was standing in my tiny galley kitchen, waiting for the coffee maker to finish dripping, wearing an oversized university sweatshirt and sweatpants. I assumed it was my neighbor complaining about a misdelivered package. I opened the door to find a man in a windbreaker holding a thick manila envelope. "Aria?" he asked, glancing down at a clipboard. "Yes," I replied, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "You have been served," he said flatly, shoving the heavy envelope into my chest before turning and walking quickly down the hallway. I stood in the doorway staring at the package. The return address, printed in bold black ink, read, "Sterling and Vance Litigation." I closed the door, walked over to my cramped dining table, and tore the envelope open. A massive stack of legal documents spilled out. The header on the first page read, "In the Orphans' Court for Anne Arundel County, Maryland. Petition to caveat the trust of Helen Margaret. Petitioners Diane and Richard. Respondent Aria." I read the opening paragraphs, and the residual morning grogginess vanished, replaced by a sharp spike of adrenaline. My parents had officially pulled the trigger. The petition alleged that Helen had been suffering from severe undiagnosed dementia during the final 2 years of her life. They claimed she lacked the testamentary capacity required to execute a binding legal document. The legal maneuver was brilliant and devastating. By filing the caveat and questioning the validity of the trust itself, they automatically triggered an injunction. The 30 to 45-day administrative waiting period Belmont had warned me about was now irrelevant. Every single bank account, investment portfolio, and liquid asset tied to the trust was immediately frozen by court order until the caveat was resolved. My mother had successfully locked the vault. I skimmed further down the pages, and the narrative Diane's high-priced lawyers were building began to take shape. It was not just an attack on Helen's mental state. It was a character assassination aimed directly at me. Opposing counsel had launched an aggressive discovery strategy right out of the gate. The attached subpoenas demanded access to 5 years of my personal bank statements, my credit card histories, my student loan balances, and my tax returns. They were not looking for evidence of Helen's dementia in those records. They were looking for evidence of my desperation. They painted a terrifying, highly persuasive picture. I was a broke, struggling biologist living paycheck to paycheck, drowning in student debt. According to the petition, I had leveraged my grandmother's failing mind, isolating her during my private visits and coercing her into changing the trust documents so I could seize her fortune to save myself from financial ruin. The gold digger angle was a classic red herring. It was designed to distract the Judge Belmont and me from looking too closely at Helen's actual medical history, forcing us to spend all our time and resources defending my character instead of defending the trust. It worked. I panicked. I sat at my table surrounded by the terrifying legal accusations, feeling the walls of my small apartment closing in. The story they spun looked so plausible on paper. I was broke. I did visit Helen alone constantly. If a judge looked at my meager bank account next to a multi-million-dollar estate, why wouldn't they assume I manipulated a lonely old woman? The high-interest bridge loan I had signed in Belmont's office suddenly felt like a noose around my neck. The funds had cleared just in time to pay the first installment of the crushing property taxes on the Annapolis estate and to hand a massive retainer fee to Belmont's litigation partner. I was now tens of thousands of dollars in debt, defending an inheritance I could not touch, fighting a battle that painted me as a manipulative predator. I spent the next 3 weeks living in a state of sustained hypervigilance. I worked 12-hour days in the wetlands, meticulously collecting water samples, only to come home and spend 4 hours scanning through my own financial records, terrified that a missed credit card payment from 3 years ago would be used as evidence of my moral bankruptcy in court. The isolation was absolute. I could not talk to my coworkers about it. I could not afford a therapist. My phone buzzed constantly with harassing emails from my sister Harper. She used a different tactic than my parents. She did not threaten legal action. She weaponized guilt. Her emails arrived daily. Subject lines reading, "Urgent" or "Please read." The content was always a variation of the same desperate plea. "The bank called again today. Mom is crying all the time. Dad's blood pressure is spiking." "Why are you doing this to us, Aria? Grandma was sick. You know she was sick. Just drop the case and let us have our lives back. You are destroying this family over money." I sat on my sagging couch one evening staring at the latest email from Harper. A cheap styrofoam container of ramen noodles sat on the coffee table in front of me. It was the 5th night in a row I had eaten noodles because I was terrified to spend even $10 on a decent meal, afraid the opposing counsel would track the purchase and use it against me. The sheer injustice of the situation boiled over. I grabbed the styrofoam container and hurled it across the living room. It smashed against the drywall, spraying broth and noodles over the cheap beige paint. I did not feel powerful. I did not feel like a stoic heroine fighting for justice. I felt incredibly resentful. I screamed into the empty apartment, cursing my grandmother. Why did she not just write a normal check? Why did she not just transfer the money while she was alive? Why did she leave me this explosive booby-trapped estate that required me to go to war with my own blood? She had known my parents were greedy, yet she tossed me into the gladiator pit to fight them, leaving me to shoulder the financial and emotional ruin while she rested peacefully in the ground. I dropped to the floor, pulling my knees to my chest, sobbing uncontrollably. The debt was suffocating. The character assassination was destroying my self-worth. I was genuinely beginning to doubt my own sanity. Maybe my parents were right. Maybe I was the villain causing all this pain. Maybe I should just call Belmont, surrender the estate, and go back to being the invisible disappointment they had always wanted me to be. Have you ever felt a deep, agonizing resentment toward a deceased loved one for the chaotic burdens they left behind? Have you ever wished they had just kept their gifts so you could keep your peace? I sat on the floor for an hour watching the ramen broth drip down the wall. The urge to quit was a heavy, seductive weight. I pulled my phone from my pocket, opening a new message to Belmont. I typed the words, "I am done. Draft the surrender paperwork." My thumb hovered over the send button. Before I could press it, my phone vibrated in my hand. It was an incoming call. The caller ID displayed Harper's name. I stared at the screen. She had never actually called me since the reading of the will. She only ever sent those carefully crafted emails. The sudden phone call broke through my spiral of self-pity. I deleted the draft to Belmont and hit the answer button, pressing the phone to my ear. Aria Harper gasped. Her voice was thin, ragged, and entirely stripped of its usual curated Annapolis polish. She sounded like she was crying so hard she could barely draw breath. "Harper," I said, sitting up straight. "What is wrong?" "Please." Harper sobbed, the sound wet and desperate. "You have to help me. I am in so much trouble. I cannot tell Mom. You have to meet me. Please." I agreed to meet Harper at Davis's Pub, a gritty, dimly lit dive bar tucked away in the maritime neighborhood of Eastport. It was the absolute last place my sister would normally be caught dead in. There were no craft cocktails or waterfront views here, just sticky wooden tables, the smell of stale beer, and local sailors who did not care what designer label you were wearing. I arrived 20 minutes later, still wearing my oversized sweatshirt, adrenaline masking the exhaustion of the past 3 weeks. I found Harper sitting in a corner booth facing the wall. She looked terrible. Her usually immaculate blonde hair was pulled into a messy knot. Her mascara was smudged, and she was wearing a plain gray t-shirt. For the first time in her adult life, Harper did not look like she was performing for an audience. She looked genuinely terrified. I slid into the booth across from her. She jumped, slightly startled by my sudden appearance. She gripped a half-empty pint glass with both hands, her knuckles stark white against the condensation. "What is going on?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "You sounded like you were dying on the phone." Harper squeezed her eyes shut and a fresh wave of tears spilled over her lashes. "I am drowning, Aria," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I am completely drowning and Mom cannot fix it anymore." Harper had spent the last 5 years building an elaborate illusion. She projected the image of a highly successful Annapolis real estate agent, but her income rarely covered her extravagant expenses. She relied on our parents to quietly cover her car payments and design her wardrobe, allowing her to maintain her social standing among her wealthy peers. My parents happily funded the facade because having a glamorous, successful daughter reflected well on them. But the inheritance freeze had cut off the cash flow. "I am $60,000 in debt," Harper choked out, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "It is all across 4 different credit cards. The interest rates are killing me. I missed 2 payments last month. The collection agencies are calling my phone 10 times a day. If I file for bankruptcy, I will lose my real estate license. My career will be over." She looked up at me, her eyes wide and panicked. "Mom promised me Grandma's money was going to wipe it all out. She promised me the day after the funeral. But now the trust is frozen, and Mom's lawyers are draining whatever cash Dad had left. They cannot help me. I am going to lose everything." My chest tightened. The fierce resentment I had felt toward my family earlier that evening softened, replaced by a familiar heavy ache. This was the dynamic we had been raised in. I was the older sister, the practical one, the one who fixed the messes when the golden child inevitably stumbled. It was a toxic reflex, but it was deeply ingrained. Seeing Harper stripped of her arrogance, genuinely terrified of losing her entire future, triggered a protective instinct I could not easily suppress. "Aria, please," Harper begged, reaching across the sticky table to grab my hands. Her grip was desperate. "You are the only one who can save me. I know you got that massive bridge loan to pay your lawyers. You have cash right now. Just write me a personal check. Please. You can take it out of my share of the estate later when the dust settles, but I need the money right now or I am finished." I looked at her tear-streaked face. I had $65,000 sitting in a dedicated checking account from the high-interest loan Belmont arranged. It was supposed to cover the brutal property taxes and my legal defense for the next 4 months. If I gave Harper $60,000, I would essentially be defunding my own legal war. I would lose the house. I would lose the case. I would be bankrupt. But if I said no, my sister would lose her career. I pulled my hands away from hers, reaching into my bag. My heart hammered against my ribs. I was making a terrible, self-destructive decision, but the conditioning of a lifetime was too strong to ignore. I pulled out my checkbook and a pen. I opened to a fresh check, my hand hovering over the date line. "Oh my God. Thank you," Harper sobbed, relief washing over her face. "Thank you, Aria. I knew you would not let me fall. I promise I will pay you back. I promise." I started writing the date. My throat felt incredibly tight. I was surrendering my grandmother's legacy to save the sister who had helped bury her without me. "Wait," Harper said quickly, reaching into her purse. Her movements were sudden, slightly too eager. "Mom's lawyer said we need to document everything during the caveat, just for the tax records and the estate accounting. I drafted a quick receipt for you to sign so they do not flag the transfer." She slid a piece of heavy cream-colored stationery across the table. It looked remarkably formal for a desperate bar meetup. I paused, the pen resting on the checkbook. I looked down at the paper. It was a single paragraph typed and printed. I read the words, and the heavy ache in my chest instantly turned into sharp, freezing ice. The receipt read, "I, Aria, am providing this personal loan of $60,000 to my sister Harper. I am doing this because I know Grandma Helen was not in her right mind when she executed her final trust, and I understand this money rightfully belongs to our family. This payment is an acknowledgement of that truth." I stopped breathing. The dive bar around me seemed to mute the background chatter and clinking glasses fading into a low, distant hum. I stared at the words, "not in her right mind." It was an admission of Helen's incompetence. It was a signed confession that the trust was invalid. Maryland is a strict two-party consent state when it comes to recording conversations. Diane's high-priced litigation firm knew they could not legally have Harper wear a wire or secretly record me admitting to the caveat allegations. They needed something admissible in court. They needed my signature on a physical document acknowledging that Helen lacked testamentary capacity. They had sent my sister to stage a breakdown to manipulate my empathy and to trick me into signing away my entire legal defense. I looked up from the paper. Harper was watching me, her tear-stained face suddenly looking very tense. The raw desperation in her eyes was gone, replaced by a calculating, anxious anticipation. She was waiting for the trap to spring shut. The betrayal did not hit me like a slow realization. It hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. The breath rushed out of my lungs. They had weaponized my love for her. They had used my instinct to protect my little sister as a tool to destroy me. I did not fold the paper neatly and slide it back. I did not deliver a calm, collected speech about boundaries and legal maneuvering. The absolute cruelty of the setup shattered the last remaining fragments of my composure. I slammed my hands down on the table, shoving myself backward. The force of my movement sent the heavy wooden table lurching forward. It slammed into Harper's chest, knocking her breath away. Her half-empty pint glass toppled over, shattering against the floor, splashing stale beer across her gray shirt and onto the sticky tiles. "What the hell?" Aria Harper shrieked, jumping up and brushing the beer off her clothes, her facade completely gone. "You are just like them," I screamed. My voice was raw, echoing loudly through the small bar. Several patrons at the bar turned to stare, but I did not care. The devastation poured out of me in a messy public outburst. You used my pity to try and ruin me. You are all exactly the same." I grabbed my checkbook, turned on my heel, and sprinted toward the exit. I burst through the heavy wooden doors into the humid night air. I ran across the cracked pavement of the parking lot, my chest heaving with dry, ragged sobs. I reached my Subaru, yanked the door open, and collapsed into the driver's seat. I slammed my hands against the steering wheel, screaming in pure, agonizing frustration. I cried until my ribs ached and my throat burned, realizing that there was no line my family would not cross. They did not just want the money. They wanted to humiliate me and force me to hand it over willingly. I wiped my face, my hands shaking violently as I started the engine. I knew now that playing defense was no longer an option. If Diane wanted a brutal legal war, I was going to give her one, and the first strike was going to be aimed directly at the foundation of her perfectly curated life. The morning of my mother's deposition arrived with a thick, suffocating humidity that coated the windows of Harrison Belmont's law office. I sat near the back of the conference room, my hands gripping the edge of the leather chair. I was not there to speak. I was there to observe. Belmont had warned me that depositions are rarely dramatic courtroom showdowns. They are slow, grinding wars of attrition designed to exhaust a witness into revealing weaknesses in their legal narrative. Diane sat across the long, polished table from Belmont. She wore a pale blue blazer, an immaculate silk scarf, and the same string of pearls she had worn to the will reading. Her posture was rigid, exuding the practiced confidence of a woman used to controlling the room. Her high-priced litigation attorney, a man named Sterling, sat beside her, reviewing a thick stack of documents. My father was not present. He had cited urgent business at the bank, but I knew the truth. Richard avoided rooms where he could not control the emotional temperature. Belmont began with standard procedural questions, establishing timelines and verifying documents. For the first 2 hours, Diane answered with clipped, flawless precision. She reiterated her claim that Helen had been suffering from severe cognitive decline during the final years of her life, painting a picture of a confused, vulnerable woman manipulated by her greedy granddaughter. Then Belmont shifted his line of questioning. He did not ask about the money. He asked about the relationship. Mrs. Evans Belmont said, pulling a financial ledger from his folder, "According to your sworn affidavit, you claim a deep, devoted relationship with your mother. Yet the financial records from the estate show that Helen paid for the installation of an elevator in her home 3 years ago, a home she owned outright. Did you assist her with that process?" Diane lifted her chin. My mother was fiercely independent. She insisted on handling her own renovations. "I see," Belmont replied smoothly. "And were you aware that she required the elevator because she could no longer safely climb the stairs to her bedroom due to severe arthritis?" "Of course I was aware," Diane snapped. "Then can you explain why during the 3 months the elevator was being installed, Helen's medical transport logs show she was driven to her physical therapy appointments entirely by a hired service and not by her devoted daughter, who lives less than 20 minutes away?" Sterling placed a hand on Diane's arm, a silent warning to stay calm. Diane's jaw tightened. "I am a busy woman, Mr. Belmont. I manage multiple charity boards and neighborhood committees. I ensured she had adequate professional transportation." Belmont leaned forward, removing his glasses. He placed them carefully on the table. "You ensured she had a taxi," he corrected gently. "Let us discuss the financial motives outlined in your caveat petition. You allege Aria coerced Helen for financial gain. Yet reviewing your own financial disclosures, we see substantial revolving debt tied to your primary residence and your husband's vehicles. Are you contesting this trust because you believe your mother was incompetent, or are you contesting it because you are desperately reliant on her assets to maintain your current lifestyle?" "Objection," Sterling interrupted smoothly. "Counsel is badgering the witness and asking speculative questions regarding personal finances irrelevant to the decedent's mental state. I am establishing motive." Belmont countered without looking away from Diane. "A motive driven by financial desperation often leads to fraudulent legal filings." The word desperation hit Diane like a physical strike. The polished Annapolis facade did not just slip. It violently shattered. "I am not desperate," Diane hissed, her voice rising an octave. The carefully modulated tone vanished, replaced by a harsh grating edge. "You know nothing about desperation. You sit in this expensive office in your expensive suit and judge me for protecting what belongs to my family," Diane Sterling murmured, trying to intercede. Diane ignored him. Her hands began to tremble, her manicured fingers gripping the edge of the mahogany table. "I grew up on the Eastern Shore," she spat, glaring at Belmont. "Do you know what that means? It does not mean sailing lessons and country clubs. It means watching my father lose his commercial fishing boat to the bank when I was 12 years old. It means waking up before dawn to pack blue crabs on old, soggy newspaper because we could not afford decent containers." Her voice broke a raw, agonizing sound that forced the breath from my lungs. I sat frozen in my chair, staring at the woman I had known my entire life. I had never heard her speak about her childhood with anything other than vague, dismissive embarrassment. My hands bled every single day. Diane sobbed, the tears finally spilling over her lashes, ruining her impeccable makeup. The crab shells sliced my fingers open, and the Old Bay seasoning burned the cuts until I cried, but I had to keep packing them because if I did not, we did not eat dinner that night. I swore to myself I would never go back to that. I swore I would build a life where I never had to smell low tide or worry about a bank taking my home ever again. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders heaving with genuine, uncontrollable grief. "My mother worked herself to the bone to build her wealth," Diane cried, her voice muffled. "She built it so we would never have to be poor again. And now you are telling me she just gave it all away, that she left me to face that terror all over again. I cannot be poor again. I cannot survive it." The conference room fell absolutely silent, save for the sound of my mother weeping. Sterling looked deeply uncomfortable, staring at his legal pad. Belmont remained impassive, but he did not press the question further. I stared at Diane's trembling shoulders, and a vivid memory slammed into my mind. I was 14 years old, standing in the mudroom of our house holding a pair of cheap, torn sneakers. I had joined an after-school ecology program that required walking through the wetlands, and my shoes were ruined. Diane had refused to buy me waterproof boots, screaming that she was not going to waste money on peasant work clothes. She told me to quit the program. The next day, Grandma Helen had picked me up from school. She drove me straight to a sporting goods store and bought me the highest quality neoprene waders they had. She handed me the receipt and said, "Never let anyone make you feel ashamed of getting your hands dirty, Aria. Dirt washes off. Arrogance does not." I realized in that moment that Helen had not bought me those boots just to support my hobby. She bought them because she knew exactly what Diane was afraid of. Diane's obsession with status, her cruelty toward my messy outdoor career, her desperate need to control Harper's glamorous image. It was not born of malice. It was entirely built on unhealed trauma. She was a terrified little girl, constantly running from the memory of bleeding hands and newspaper packaging. For a fleeting moment, the blinding rage I had carried since the funeral dissolved. I did not see the toxic socialite who had hidden my grandmother's death from me. I saw a profoundly broken woman who was drowning in her own fear. Without thinking, I stood up from my chair at the back of the room. I walked slowly to the edge of the conference table. Belmont watched me carefully, but did not intervene. I reached across the polished wood and placed my hand over Diane's trembling fingers. My knuckles were calloused from fieldwork, a stark contrast to her perfectly manicured nails. Diane flinched at the contact, lowering her hands from her face. She looked up at me, her eyes red and puffy, the fear raw and exposed in her gaze. I felt a profound, messy wave of pity wash over me. It was an uncomfortable, agonizing empathy that twisted my stomach into knots. Have you ever seen the exact moment your abuser's trauma explains their toxicity? Does understanding their agonizing pain mean you have to excuse the destruction they cause? I looked down at my mother, my thumb brushing lightly against the back of her hand. "I understand why you are terrified, Mom," I said softly. "I really do." Diane let out a ragged breath, leaning slightly toward my touch. But I cannot let you destroy Grandma's legacy just to make yourself feel safe. I finished, my voice steadying. I pulled my hand back, stepping away from the table. The pity remained heavy and sad, but the boundary was set. Understanding her pain did not obligate me to set myself on fire to keep her warm. I returned to my seat at the back of the room. Diane stared at me, her expression hardening as the vulnerability vanished, replaced by the desperate defensive armor she had worn her entire life. She wiped her eyes with a tissue Sterling handed her, squaring her shoulders. Belmont cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence. "If we may continue, Mrs. Evans," he said, adjusting his glasses, "I would like to pivot to the specific medical claims outlined in your caveat." The emotional breakthrough was over. The legal war resumed, but the deposition had revealed a critical weakness in their strategy. Diane's emotional fragility meant her lawyers would lean heavily on the technical aspects of the caveat to avoid putting her on the stand. They needed to prove Helen's dementia using medical records, and that meant I needed to find those records before they did. The problem was, I had absolutely no idea where to start looking, and the clock was rapidly running out. The deposition had exposed Diane's emotional instability, but Harrison Belmont warned me that empathy would not win a caveat petition in the Maryland Orphans Court. The entire case hinged on one objective factor. We needed irrefutable proof of Grandma Helen's testamentary capacity. We needed her medical records. I assumed gathering those records would be a simple administrative task. I was the designated trustee, so the law should have granted me immediate access. I was wrong. The healthcare system operates behind an impenetrable wall of bureaucratic red tape, and the opposing counsel knew exactly how to exploit it. Helen's primary care physician, a Dr. Aris Thorne, had managed her health for over 20 years. He was the one who had conducted her annual cognitive evaluations. Finding him was my first priority. I spent 3 days calling his Annapolis practice, navigating automated menus, and leaving urgent voicemails. On the 4th day, an exasperated receptionist finally answered my call. Dr. Thorne retired 8 months ago, she informed me. He sold the practice to a corporate network and relocated to a private community in Naples, Florida. He does not retain any of his old patient files. You have to submit a formal request to the new corporate records department. I filled out the necessary release forms and faxed them to the corporate office. A week passed without a response. When I finally reached a records manager, the news was devastating. Because Diane's lawyers had filed an active caveat contesting your legal authority as trustee, the corporate legal department flagged the request, the manager explained, sounding utterly bored by my panic. They will not release the decedent's medical history until a judge formally rules on the validity of your status. We cannot risk a HIPAA violation. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking. It was a perfect, inescapable catch-22. I needed the medical records to prove I was the legal trustee, but the hospital would not release the medical records until the court proved I was the legal trustee. The financial clock was ticking louder every day. The high-interest bridge loan I had taken out was burning through my checking account. I had just written another massive check to Belmont's firm to cover the costs of preparing for the upcoming mediation. My credit score was dropping, and I was falling behind on my own rent. The stress began to manifest physically. I developed a persistent migraine that sat behind my right eye, throbbing in time with my pulse. I lost my appetite, surviving mostly on black coffee and toast. My fieldwork suffered. I mislabeled 3 water samples during a crucial dead zone survey on the bay, earning a sharp reprimand from my research director. I was drowning. Diane's strategy of attrition was working perfectly. She did not need to win the case on its merits. She just needed to starve me out until I surrendered. It was a Tuesday evening, raining hard enough that the drops sounded like gravel hitting the thin windows of my apartment. I paced the narrow length of my living room, running my hands through my unwashed hair. I was holding my phone, staring at Harrison Belmont's contact information. The urge to quit was a heavy, suffocating blanket wrapping around my chest. If I just called him and told him to draft the surrender paperwork, the nightmare would end. The debt would stop accumulating. Diane would get the Annapolis estate, Harper would pay off her secret credit cards, and I could go back to my quiet, invisible life. It felt so incredibly easy to just let them win. I took a shaky breath, pressing my thumb over the call button. As I turned to pace back toward the kitchen, my foot caught the edge of a heavy cardboard box sitting on the floor. I stumbled my knee, slamming hard onto the cheap laminate flooring. Pain shot up my leg. I looked down. It was a box of random items I had hastily shoved into my closet years ago when I moved out of my parents' house. I had pulled it out last week searching for old tax returns and left it sitting in the middle of the room. Spilling out of the top of the box was the battered copy of Silent Spring, the paperback I had snatched off Diane's coffee table the day Belmont read the will. The sight of the book triggered a sudden explosive surge of anger. I was furious at my family for their greed. I was furious at myself for being so weak. And most of all, I was furiously resentful toward Grandma Helen. "Why did you do this to me?" I screamed at the empty apartment, grabbing the paperback from the box. "Why did you leave me this mess instead of just cutting a normal check? You knew they would destroy me over this house. You knew I could not afford to fight them. You set me up to fail." I hurled the book across the room with all the strength I had left. It flew through the air, tumbling end over end, and slammed violently against the cast-iron radiator beneath the window. The impact made a loud, sharp cracking sound. I dropped back onto the floor, pulling my knees to my chest, burying my face in my arms. I sat there for several minutes, letting the angry, ragged sobs tear through my throat until my lungs burned. The apartment was silent, except for the steady drumming of the rain outside. Eventually, the tears subsided into exhausted hiccups. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my sweatshirt, my head pounding. I looked across the room toward the radiator. The paperback had not just hit the metal and fallen. The spine had split entirely open. The front and back covers lay splayed flat against the floorboards. I squinted, confused by the strange shape of the book. The pages were not fanned out. They were rigid. I pushed myself up off the floor, my bruised knee throbbing, and walked slowly toward the window. I knelt down beside the radiator and picked up the broken book. My breath caught in my throat. The center pages of the paperback had been meticulously glued together and hollowed out, creating a hidden rectangular compartment. Resting snugly inside the hollowed-out space was a small, silver USB flash drive. My hands began to tremble so violently I almost dropped the book again. I grabbed the flash drive, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I practically sprinted to my small dining table, throwing my laptop open and jamming the USB into the port. A single video file appeared on the screen. It was simply titled, "For Aria." I clicked play. The video opened to a wide shot of Grandma Helen's sunroom. The familiar view of the Severn River stretched out behind the large bay windows. Helen sat in her favorite floral armchair, wearing a crisp white blouse and her signature silver cardigan. She looked frail, her frame thin, but her eyes were sharp, bright, and intensely focused on the camera. Sitting across from her, holding a clipboard, was Dr. Eris Thorne. "Hello, Aria," Helen said, her voice clear and steady through the laptop speakers. "I imagine if you are watching this, my daughter has already filed a lawsuit claiming I lost my mind. Diane always was terribly predictable when it came to money." A choked gasp escaped my throat. I pressed my hand over my mouth, staring at the screen. Helen turned to Dr. Thorne. "Proceed, Aris," she instructed. "Let us get this legal theater over with so I can enjoy my afternoon tea." For the next 45 minutes, I watched an irrefutable, medically supervised cognitive evaluation unfold. Dr. Thorne asked Helen a series of standardized questions designed to test memory spatial awareness and executive function. Helen answered every single one with flawless accuracy, occasionally rolling her eyes at the simplicity of the tasks. Then Belmont stepped into the frame. He handed Helen a thick stack of documents. It was the Irrevocable Trust Agreement. Helen held the paperwork up to the camera. "I, Helen Margaret, being of sound mind and acting entirely of my own free will, do hereby execute this trust." She read aloud, her diction precise and commanding. "I am intentionally and specifically disinheriting my daughter Diane and my granddaughter Harper." She lowered the papers, looking directly into the camera lens. Her expression softened, revealing a profound sadness that mirrored the grief I had seen in Diane during the deposition. "I love my daughter," Helen said quietly. "But her obsession with status has poisoned her soul. If I leave her this wealth, it will only fund her destructive vanity and enable Harper's endless deceit. I am leaving this estate to Aria because she is the only person in this family who values truth over appearances." Helen leaned forward, her gaze piercing through the screen. "I know this will be a burden, Aria. I know they will fight you, but I also know you have the strength to withstand them. Do not let them take this. You are my legacy, not the money, you." The video ended, cutting to a black screen. I sat frozen in my chair. The suffocating weight that had been crushing my chest for weeks evaporated, leaving me gasping for air, as if I had just breached the surface of a deep ocean. The medical records did not matter anymore. The hospital's bureaucratic red tape was completely irrelevant. Helen had anticipated the exact legal strategy Diane would use, and she had built an airtight defense to destroy it. A sound bubbled up in my throat. It started as a wet, ragged sob, but it quickly shifted. The absurdity of the situation, the sheer brilliance of a grandmother hiding the ultimate legal weapon inside a book her daughter deemed trash, hit me all at once. I burst into hysterical, uncontrollable laughter. Tears streamed down my face, dripping onto the keyboard, as I laughed until my stomach ached. I grabbed the silver flash drive, pulling it from the laptop, and clutched it tightly against my chest. I was not going to call Belmont to draft surrender papers. I was going to call him to prepare for war. The red herring had distracted me, but Helen had left me the kill shot, and I knew exactly when I was going to use it. The Maryland Orphans Court requires all contested estate cases to undergo mandatory mediation before proceeding to a formal trial. The goal is to force families into a settlement, sparing the court docket and preventing dirty laundry from entering the public record. I sat beside Harrison Belmont in a sterile, windowless conference room in downtown Annapolis. The air conditioning buzzed aggressively, creating a low, constant drone that set my teeth on edge. I wore a modest navy blazer, my hands folded neatly on the faux wood table. I appeared calm, but underneath the desk, my leg was bouncing with nervous energy. Diane and Richard sat directly across from us. Diane wore a pale gray suit, her posture rigid, her expression locked into a mask of weary endurance. She wanted to project the image of a grieving daughter, forced into this unpleasantness by a greedy child. Richard sat next to her, looking uncomfortable, checking his watch, as if this mediation were merely a minor scheduling conflict in his day. Their high-priced litigator, Sterling, sat at the head of their side of the table, flanked by two junior associates, organizing a mountain of files. The court-appointed mediator, a retired judge named Davis, reviewed his notes and asked Sterling to present their initial claims regarding Helen's testamentary capacity. Sterling launched into a polished, well-rehearsed narrative. He cited Helen's age, her physical frailty, and vague anecdotes from Diane about moments of alleged confusion during her final months. He painted a picture of a woman whose mind had slipped away, leaving her vulnerable to manipulation. He concluded his opening remarks with a smug, confident nod. Belmont did not offer a rebuttal. He simply reached into his briefcase, pulled out a small black laptop, and placed it on the table facing Sterling and my parents. He inserted the silver USB drive I had found in the hollowed-out book. I believe opposing counsel's entire argument hinges on the assertion that Helen lacked the cognitive capacity to understand the documents she signed. Belmont stated, his voice dry and devoid of theatrics. "Let us consult the decedent directly on that matter." He pressed play. The volume on the laptop was turned all the way up. Helen's voice cut through the sterile conference room, clear, commanding, and unmistakably lucid. "I imagine if you are watching this, my daughter has already filed a lawsuit claiming I lost my mind." Diane gasped. The sound was sharp and involuntary, as if the air had been punched from her lungs. She stared at the screen, her eyes wide with shock. For the next 10 minutes, Belmont played the crucial segments of the video. The room watched in absolute silence as Dr. Thorne conducted his medical evaluation. They watched Helen flawlessly recount her financial assets, recall specific dates, and demonstrate sharp executive function. They watched her read the trust document aloud, her voice steady and unwavering. and then Belmont let the video play the final devastating monologue. I am intentionally and specifically disinheriting my daughter Diane and my granddaughter Harper. The color drained from Diane's face. She looked physically ill. Richard shifted in his chair, his gaze darting toward the floor. I am leaving this estate to Aria because she is the only person in this family who values truth over appearances. Belmont paused the video, closing the laptop with a soft click. Sterling did not say a word. The polished, aggressive litigator seemed to deflate in his chair. He looked at his junior associates who were staring at their meticulously organized files as if the paperwork had suddenly caught fire. The foundation of their entire caveat petition, the allegation of dementia, was completely destroyed. The video was irrefutable medical and legal proof of capacity. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. Diane recovered first. The shock morphed instantly into a desperate, frantic calculation. She realized the legal war was lost, but her survival instincts, honed by a childhood of grinding poverty, demanded she salvage something. She leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly on the table. "Fine, Diane," said her voice tight and brittle. "The trust is valid. But you cannot simply evict us, Aria. We have established tenancy. We have lived in that house for 2 decades. The legal process to remove us will take months. It will drain the estate in legal fees and drag this family through a humiliating public trial." She turned to Sterling, giving a sharp nod. Sterling cleared his throat, attempting to regain his professional footing. "My client is willing to vacate the premises and formally withdraw the caveat petition, saving the estate considerable time and litigation costs. In exchange, we are requesting a settlement of $500,000 paid directly from the trust's liquid assets to facilitate their relocation." I stared at them. They had spent weeks trying to destroy my character, dragging my name through the mud, forcing me into crippling debt, and now that they were caught in their own trap, they wanted $500,000 just to walk away. It was extortion. I shook my head, a harsh, bitter laugh escaping my lips. "No!" Richard slammed his hand flat on the table. The sudden noise echoed loudly in the small room. He dropped the passive, uncomfortable facade. He was furious that I was defying him, furious that this situation was forcing him to engage in a messy conflict he could no longer ignore. "You listen to me, Aria," Richard demanded, his voice rising, carrying the heavy, authoritative tone he used to discipline me when I was a child. "You are being completely unreasonable. We are trying to find a compromise. We gave you everything. We raised you. We paid for your college tuition so you could go play in the mud and pretend to be a scientist. You owe us this money. You owe us some respect." The word "owe" hit a tripwire buried deep inside my chest. For 29 years I had swallowed my anger. I had minimized my feelings to keep the peace. I had accepted their cruelty because I believed I was indebted to them for my upbringing. Richard's ultimate manipulation, weaponizing my education to force my compliance, was the exact trigger that finally snapped my restraint. I grabbed the yellow legal notepad sitting in front of me and threw it across the conference table. It smacked hard against Richard's chest, dropping onto his lap. He flinched, staring at me in utter shock. I had never raised my voice to my father in public. I had never shown aggression. "You did not pay for my college, Dad," I yelled. My voice was raw, shaking with the force of the adrenaline pumping through my veins. Richard blinked, confusion momentarily replacing the anger on his face. "What are you talking about? Of course we did." "No, you did not," I fired back, leaning across the table, closing the distance between us. "Grandma Helen's trust paid for my tuition. Mr. Belmont gave me the bank statements last week when we were reviewing the estate's financial history. Helen transferred the exact cost of my tuition to your bank account every single semester. You just took the money, paid the school, and claimed the credit. You let me spend 10 years feeling guilty and indebted to you for something my grandmother provided." The revelation hit the room like a bomb. Diane looked away, her jaw tight, confirming she knew the truth. Richard's face flushed a deep, mottled red. His authority evaporated. He had been exposed as a fraud, claiming parental sacrifice while secretly using his mother-in-law's wealth to fund it. "I owe you absolutely nothing." I continued, my breathing heavy, my chest heaving. You do not get to claim you raised me when you could not even be bothered to let me say goodbye to the woman who actually paid for my life. The raw grief surrounding Helen's funeral, the inciting incident that had sparked this entire war, flared up again. The anger shifted into agonizing pain. I looked at my father, the man who was supposed to protect me, demanding an answer to the question that had haunted me for weeks. "Why did you let her hide the funeral from me, Dad?" I demanded, tears finally spilling over my lashes. "Why did you stand there and watch them bury her, knowing I was sitting in a boat on the river completely unaware? Why did you not just pick up the phone and call me?" Richard looked at his hands. He could not meet my gaze. He looked small, pathetic, and entirely defeated. "It was just easier," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "Your mother was so stressed about the arrangements. You always get so emotional. It was just easier to keep the peace." He sacrificed my chance to mourn my grandmother because he did not want to deal with his wife's complaints or my tears. He chose convenience over his own daughter's grief. A wave of pure disgust washed over me. It was a suffocating, nauseating feeling. I realized in that moment that my father was not a victim of Diane's ambition. He was an active, willing participant in my alienation because cowardice was his default setting. I stood up from my chair so fast it screeched against the floor. "I am not paying you a single dime to leave that house," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, trembling whisper. "You can pack your bags, or I will drag this all the way to trial and let a judge humiliate you on the public record." I did not wait for a response. I turned on my heel and stormed out of the mediation room. I pushed through the heavy glass doors into the hallway, my chest tight, hyperventilating as the adrenaline began to crash. My hands were shaking violently. I pressed my back against the cool plaster wall, closing my eyes, trying to force air into my burning lungs. I had refused the settlement. I had declared war. The mediation was officially a failure. We were going to trial. We're going. And as I stood in the hallway trying to calm my racing heart, I knew Diane's lawyers would not go down without a fight. The dementia argument was dead, but they still had one card left to play, and it involved putting my sister on the witness stand to commit perjury. The Anne Arundel County Orphans Court sits in the historic district of Annapolis, housed within a grand brick building with white columns that project centuries of Maryland legal authority. It is a space designed to intimidate, filled with heavy mahogany benches, echoing marble floors, and the imposing silence of judicial procedure. I arrived on the morning of the trial, wearing a dark gray blazer I had purchased off a clearance rack 5 years ago. The shoulders were too tight, the sleeves slightly too short, and I felt sweat prickling down my spine the moment I crossed the threshold. The air conditioning was aggressive, but the stifling tension in the room made it impossible to cool down. I took my seat next to Harrison Belmont at the petitioner's table. Across the aisle, Diane and Richard sat flanked by Sterling and his junior associates. Diane wore a somber charcoal dress, leaning into the role of the grieving daughter forced into a courtroom by a treacherous child. Harper sat in the gallery right behind them, her blonde hair pulled back neatly, her posture impeccable. The judge, an older man with a severe expression, banged his gavel, formally commencing the trial. Sterling wasted no time. With the video evidence completely neutralizing their initial claim that Helen suffered from dementia, they had pivoted to a new, equally damaging strategy: undue influence. They needed to prove that while Helen might have possessed basic cognitive function, her physical frailty made her vulnerable. They alleged that I had exploited her weakened state, isolating her during my private visits, and manipulating her into changing the trust documents out of fear or misplaced gratitude. Sterling called me to the stand for cross-examination. I walked to the witness box, my knees shaking. I swore to tell the truth, but sitting in that elevated chair, staring out at the courtroom, I felt like a criminal awaiting sentencing. Sterling approached the podium. He did not yell. He used a slow, methodical cadence, dissecting my character with surgical precision. He walked the court through my finances, highlighting the glaring contrast between my modest salary and the multi-million-dollar estate I stood to inherit. He painted a masterful narrative. I was a struggling biologist, drowning in student debt, living paycheck to paycheck in a cramped apartment. According to Sterling, I had recognized my grandmother's failing physical health and swooped in, acting as her primary caretaker, specifically to position myself as her sole heir, cutting off her devoted daughter and husband in the process. Miss Evans Sterling asked, resting his hands on the podium. During the final 3 months of Helen's life, you visited her property an average of 4 times a week. Is that correct? Yes, I stammered, gripping the edge of the witness box. But I was not manipulating her. I was just checking on her. And during those visits, Sterling continued smoothly. You often assisted her with paying bills, sorting mail, and reviewing financial statements. You were heavily involved in her personal affairs, despite having no formal financial training. She asked for my help. I argued, my voice rising defensively. Diane and Richard were never around. They were always busy. Someone had to make sure the contractors installing the elevator were paid on time. So you admit you were managing her finances during a period of extreme physical vulnerability, Sterling pressed. You positioned yourself as her sole lifeline, isolating her from her actual daughter, and shortly after she revised her trust to leave you everything. I did not isolate her. I fired back, my emotional nature working entirely against me. The sweat on my palms made the wood of the witness box feel slick. She isolated herself from them because they only ever visited when they wanted a check. Objection, Sterling said calmly, turning to the judge. Speculative and non-responsive. Sustained, the judge ruled, glaring at me over his glasses. Please answer the question, asked Miss Evans. Sterling continued his brutal examination for another 30 minutes, baiting me into defensive emotional responses that made me look desperate and erratic. By the time I stepped down from the stand, my hands were shaking violently. Sterling had successfully planted the seed of doubt. I looked like a broke, opportunistic granddaughter who had preyed on a frail old woman. Belmont patted my arm as I collapsed into my chair. "Breathe, Aria," he murmured. "He has played his hand. Now it is our turn." Belmont stood up, smoothing his suit jacket. He approached the podium and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, the petitioner's entire argument of undue influence relies on the assertion that Aria isolated a vulnerable Helen Margaret from her devoted primary caretakers, Diane and Richard Evans. I call Harper Evans to the stand." Harper stood up from the gallery. She looked confident, smoothing her designer skirt as she walked to the witness box. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore the oath. Harper was ready. Diane's lawyers had clearly prepped her for this moment. She was going to deliver the final blow to my case by testifying that Diane and Richard were present and actively involved in Helen's care, proving that I had aggressively forced them out. Belmont approached the witness box. He did not carry a thick file of legal documents. He simply held a small remote control connected to the large monitor positioned next to the judge's bench. Miss Evans Belmont began his tone polite and conversational. "In your sworn affidavit submitted to this court 3 weeks ago, you stated that your parents, Diane and Richard, were heavily involved in Helen's daily care during the final month of her life." "Yes," Harper replied smoothly. "My parents were there constantly. We all were. We practically lived at her house, making sure she was comfortable. And you specifically noted in your affidavit that during the critical 2-week period leading up to Helen signing the revised trust documents, your mother was personally administering her medication and managing her meals." Belmont continued. "That is correct." Harper confirmed, her voice steady. "Aria is lying when she says we were not around. She deliberately scheduled her visits when she knew we had to step out for brief errands." Belmont nodded slowly. He adjusted his glasses and pressed a button on his remote. The large monitor in the courtroom flickered to life. An image appeared on the screen. It was a photograph of Diane and Harper. They were wearing oversized sunglasses and wide-brimmed sun hats, holding bright orange Aperol Spritz cocktails. They were sitting on a pristine white sand beach, the ocean glittering in the background. The caption below the photo read, "Soaking up the sun in the OBX. Much-needed girls' trip to escape the stress." The courtroom went incredibly still. Diane froze in her chair. Belmont pressed the button again. The next image showed a sprawling beachfront rental home in the Outer Banks of North Carolina. The caption read, "Our private oasis for the next 14 days. Pure luxury. Miss Evans Belmont said, his voice dropping into a razor-sharp register. "These photographs were pulled directly from your public Instagram feed, the social media account you use to promote your real estate business." Harper stared at the monitor, her face draining of color. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Belmont walked closer to the witness box. He pointed to the corner of the screen. "I would like to direct the court's attention to the metadata embedded in these public posts. The timestamps and geotags on these photographs correspond exactly to the 14-day period you swore under penalty of perjury that you and your mother were spoon-feeding a sick woman in Annapolis, Maryland." Sterling jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This evidence was not properly introduced during discovery. The photographs are a matter of public record." "Your Honor," Belmont countered instantly, "they are directly relevant to impeaching the credibility of the witness and proving the affidavit submitted by opposing counsel contains deliberate falsehoods." "Overruled," the judge barked, glaring at Sterling, before turning a furious gaze toward the witness box. Belmont turned back to Harper. The quiet, polite demeanor vanished. He was a seasoned litigator executing a kill shot. "You were in North Carolina." Miss Evans Belmont stated the words cracking like a whip across the silent courtroom. "You and your mother abandoned Helen during her most vulnerable period to take a luxury vacation. You left Aria as her sole caretaker, and then you came into this court and lied under oath to frame your sister for a crime she did not commit." Harper gripped the railing of the witness box. The confident Annapolis real estate agent facade shattered completely. The terrifying reality of the situation crashed over her. "Do you understand the penalties for perjury in the state of Maryland?" Belmont demanded, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "You are facing severe criminal charges, massive fines, and the permanent revocation of your real estate license." The threat of losing her career, the only thing Harper truly cared about, was the final trigger. She broke. Harper let out a loud, ragged sob. The tears started flowing, instantly ruining her carefully applied makeup. She looked frantically toward the petitioner's table. "It was not my idea." Harper shrieked, her voice echoing wildly through the courtroom. She pointed a shaking finger directly at Diane. "Mom made me do it. She told me the lawyers needed an affidavit proving we were taking care of Grandma. She promised me the trust money would cover my credit card debt if I just signed the paper. She said the judge would never check my Instagram." Diane leaped out of her chair. "Harper, shut your mouth right now," Diane screamed, her own composure entirely destroyed by the betrayal. "Order in this court!" the judge bellowed, slamming his gavel down repeatedly. The sharp cracks reverberated like gunfire, but the chaos had already been unleashed. Harper continued sobbing hysterically in the witness box, wiping her nose with the back of her hand, crying that she was going to go to jail, and it was all Diane's fault. Diane was yelling at Sterling to do something, while Richard sat paralyzed in his chair, staring straight ahead as his family publicly imploded. The social media obsession Diane and Harper valued so deeply, the curated illusion of wealth they used to mask their toxic reality, was the exact trap that destroyed their legal case. Belmont stood calmly at the podium, watching the carnage unfold. He did not ask another question. He simply turned to the judge. "No further questions, Your Honor," Belmont said quietly. The gavel banged again, demanding silence. The judge ordered a 30-minute recess to review the newly submitted evidence and confer with counsel regarding the perjury admission. As I sat in my ill-fitting blazer watching my mother and sister tear each other apart in front of a gallery of strangers, the overwhelming anxiety I had carried for months finally vanished. The battle was over. The verdict was inevitable. But as the courtroom cleared, the crushing reality of what came next began to settle heavily on my shoulders. The 30-minute recess felt like holding my breath underwater. The sterile hallway outside the courtroom was tense and quiet. I stood near the water fountain, staring at the scuffed linoleum floor, listening to the muffled, frantic arguments coming from the small consultation room where Diane, Richard, and Sterling had retreated. The muffled shouting occasionally spiked in volume, Diane's shrill panic bleeding through the heavy wooden door. When the bailiff finally called us back into the courtroom, the atmosphere had drastically shifted. The aggressive, blustering energy Sterling had brought to the morning session was entirely gone. He sat at the petitioner's table, staring rigidly at his legal pad. Diane looked physically ill, her perfectly styled hair now slightly disheveled, her hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly her knuckles were white. Harper refused to look at anyone, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor, fresh mascara tracks staining her cheeks. The judge entered the room, his black robes billowing slightly as he took his seat at the high bench. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He arranged his notes, adjusted his microphone, and looked directly at Diane and Richard. "This court has reviewed the evidence presented this morning." The judge began, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "The burden of proof in a caveat petition rests entirely on the petitioners. You alleged that Helen Margaret lacked testamentary capacity due to severe cognitive decline and was subjected to undue influence by the respondent." The judge paused, pulling a pair of reading glasses from his pocket. "The video evidence submitted by the defense is irrefutable," he stated flatly. The decedent clearly and lucidly demonstrated her capacity to execute the irrevocable trust. Furthermore, the testimony provided by Harper Evans regarding the caretaking dynamic was definitively proven to be a fabricated narrative supported by fraudulent affidavits. Diane let out a sharp, trembling breath, sinking slightly lower in her chair. Therefore, the judge continued, his gaze narrowing. "This court dismisses the caveat petition in its entirety. The irrevocable trust executed by Helen Margaret is hereby upheld as valid and binding. Aria Evans is officially recognized as the sole trustee and legal beneficiary of the estate, including all liquid assets and real property." I let out a slow, shaky exhale. Belmont squeezed my forearm, a silent acknowledgement of the victory. The crippling debt, the character assassination, the months of terror, it was over. I had won. But the judge was not finished. He shuffled his papers, leaning forward to look directly at Sterling. "Counsel," the judge said, his tone dropping into a dangerous reprimand. "The introduction of knowingly false testimony and fraudulent affidavits wastes the time of this court and maliciously drains the resources of the defending estate." Sterling opened his mouth to defend himself, but the judge raised a hand, cutting him off immediately. Under the specific provisions of Maryland probate law, the judge announced when a caveat is determined to have been filed frivolously or in bad faith, the court possesses the authority to shift the financial burden of the litigation. Given the egregious perjury demonstrated in this courtroom today, I am invoking that clause. The courtroom went dead silent. The petitioners, Diane and Richard Evans, the judge, ruled, his voice striking the room like a hammer, are hereby held personally liable for all legal fees and court costs incurred by the respondent Aria Evans during the defense of this caveat. The ruling hit the petitioner's table like a physical explosion. Diane let out a shrill, agonizing wail. It was not a performative cry or an angry shout. It was the raw, visceral sound of a woman watching her deepest, most terrifying nightmare become reality. The high society armor she had spent her entire adult life building was completely obliterated in a single sentence. She was not just losing the multi-million-dollar inheritance she had banked her future on. She was suddenly saddled with my massive legal bills, on top of the hundreds of billable hours she already owed Sterling's high-priced firm. Diane was financially ruined. The crushing poverty of the Eastern Shore she had spent decades outrunning had finally caught up to her. Diane lunged toward Richard, clutching the lapels of his suit jacket. "Richard," she sobbed hysterically, her voice breaking. "Richard, fix it. Tell him we do not have the money. We cannot pay this. We will lose everything." Richard did not comfort her. He did not speak. The mid-level bank executive who had spent his life avoiding conflict simply sat paralyzed in his chair, staring blankly at the judge, realizing that his cowardice and complicity had finally bankrupted him. The judge slammed his gavel down, shouting for order in the court, but Diane could not stop sobbing. The bailiff had to step forward, physically ushering my parents and their silent, defeated lawyer out of the courtroom. I sat at the defense table in my cheap, ill-fitting blazer, watching my family's total collapse. Belmont closed his briefcase with a quiet snap. "We did it, Aria," he said gently. "The funds will be unfrozen by Monday. You can pay off the bridge loan. The estate is secure." I nodded, standing up slowly. My legs felt like lead. I walked out of the courthouse alone. I pushed through the heavy brass doors and stepped out onto the cobblestone streets of Annapolis. The August heat was stifling, the humidity pressing down on the historic brick buildings. Tourists in pastel shorts walked past me, licking ice cream cones, completely oblivious to the brutal legal execution that had just occurred inside. There was no joyous victory march, no sense of triumphant vindication. I did not feel like a powerful heir claiming her rightful throne. I felt completely hollowed out. I walked 2 blocks away from the courthouse, heading toward the city docks. The smell of the Chesapeake Bay hit my nose, a mix of salt, old wood, and diesel fuel. I found an empty wooden bench facing the water and sat down heavily. I stared blankly at the dark, choppy waves slapping against the wooden pilings. The legal war was won. My grandmother's trust was upheld. The financial anxiety that had been suffocating me for months was officially erased. But as I sat there watching a sleek white sailboat glide past the docks, the reality of my victory settled over me like a suffocating shroud. I had won the deed to the Annapolis estate. The multi-million-dollar waterfront mansion was legally mine. But my parents were still living inside it. The judge's ruling did not magically teleport them out of the house. The agonizing legal reality Belmont had warned me about months ago was now my immediate future. I had to initiate a formal eviction. I had to hire a process server to hand my own mother a 60-day notice to vacate. I had to force my father out of the only home he had known for 20 years. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees and burying my face in my hands. The sheer logistical nightmare of what came next was paralyzing. I was going to have to make them homeless. The crippling debt Diane now faced meant they could not simply buy a new house. They would not be able to qualify for a luxury rental with their newly destroyed credit. I was about to push them out onto the street. The guilt twisted my stomach into agonizing knots. I had spent my entire life trying to protect my sister, trying to earn my parents' love, trying to avoid being the emotional burden Diane always accused me of being. Now, I was the executioner of their ruined lives. The boundary I had fought so desperately to establish felt less like a protective wall and more like a permanent, impenetrable chasm. Severing a toxic family sounds empowering in therapy. It looks triumphant on paper. But sitting alone on that bench, smelling the salt water, the reality was just incredibly sad. I had won my grandmother's fortunes, but I had permanently lost my family. And the hardest part, the actual physical removal of my parents, was still waiting for me. The Monday following the trial, the bureaucratic dam finally broke. Harrison Belmont called my cell phone while I was labeling water samples in the lab, his voice carrying a rare note of genuine warmth. The injunction has been lifted, Aria. The trust accounts are officially unfrozen. The funds are cleared and accessible. I set down my dry erase marker. I logged into my bank portal on my phone, my thumb hovering nervously over the screen. When the dashboard loaded, the numbers sitting in the checking account were staggering. It was not just enough to clear the high-interest bridge loan. It was enough to clear my student debt, pay my rent for the next 10 years, and never worry about buying cheap ramen again. I immediately executed a wire transfer, paying off the bridge loan in full. The suffocating weight of the debt evaporated instantly. I was no longer drowning in high-interest panic. I was financially secure, but the security did not bring peace. It just unlocked the next horrifying phase of the war. I authorized Belmont's office to draft the formal notice to vacate. Under Maryland law, because my parents had established a long-term month-to-month tenancy without a formal lease, I was required to give them 60 days written notice before I could file for a wrongful detainer in the district court. I hired a private process server. I gave him the address of the sprawling colonial estate in Annapolis. I told him to deliver the documents directly into my mother's hands. The server completed the job at 2 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon. He sent me a brief text confirming delivery. I spent the rest of the workday feeling like I had swallowed a stone. I avoided looking at my phone, terrified of the explosive rage I knew was coming. I expected Diane to bombard me with furious texts, screaming voicemails, and vicious threats. The explosion never came. The afternoon passed in complete silence. I returned to my cramped apartment, pacing the narrow living room, jumping every time a neighbor walked heavily down the hall. The silence was far more unnerving than Diane's screaming would have been. It felt like standing on a beach watching the water recede rapidly, knowing a tsunami was building just out of sight. At 9 o'clock that evening, my phone finally rang. It was not Diane. The caller ID displayed my father's name. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering against my ribs. Richard avoided conflict at all costs. He preferred to let Diane handle the dirty work while he retreated to his study or his sailboat. For him to call me directly meant the situation had deteriorated past the point where Diane could control it. I took a shaky breath and answered the call. "Hello," Aria, Richard said. His voice was unrecognizable. The polished, authoritative tone of the mid-level bank executive was entirely gone. He sounded hollowed-out, frail, and profoundly old. "Dad?" I replied, my voice tightening defensively. "If you are calling to yell at me about the notice, Belmont said I have to follow the legal timeline. You have 60 days. "I am not calling to yell," Richard interrupted, his voice cracking slightly. "I am calling to ask for your help." I froze. My father never asked for help. He issued directives. He managed situations. He did not plead. "Your mother is heavily sedated." Richard continued, the exhaustion heavy in his words. Her blood pressure spiked dangerously high after the server left. The doctor had to prescribe a sedative just to stop her from hyperventilating. The anger I had been holding onto deflated, replaced by a sudden sickening spike of anxiety. "Is she okay?" I asked, the ingrained daughterly concern bypassing my anger. "She is asleep." Richard sighed. "But Aria, I do not know what to do. The judge's ruling, the legal fees. We are drowning. Sterling's firm is demanding immediate payment for the caveat trial, and now we are on the hook for Belmont's fees too. My retirement accounts are decimated. The bank is restructuring, and they are encouraging early retirement. I cannot pull any more equity." He paused, taking a ragged breath. "My credit is ruined, Aria. If you force this eviction, we cannot qualify for a new mortgage. We cannot even pass a background check for a decent rental property. We have nowhere to go. Harper is barely avoiding bankruptcy herself. We are completely out of options." The heavy stone in my stomach doubled in weight. I gripped the edge of my kitchen counter. They were ruined. The staggering financial arrogance they had displayed at the celebration of life party had completely collapsed, burying them in the rubble. "Please, Aria," my father begged. The raw desperation in his voice broke my heart. He was crying. My emotionally detached father was weeping on the phone. "Please do not make us leave. We will pay you rent. We will figure something out. Just revoke the notice. Give us time. You have millions now. You do not need the house immediately. Please do not put your mother on the street." I closed my eyes, tears spilling hot down my cheeks. The internal war was agonizing. Everything in my biology, everything in my social conditioning screamed at me to save him. He was my father. He was crying. He was begging for mercy. It would be so incredibly easy to just call Belmont and cancel the eviction. I could let them stay. I could absorb the property taxes with the trust funds. I could fix their catastrophic mess and stop the pain immediately. But I thought about the cemetery. I thought about standing in my muddy waders staring at Helen's fresh grave, realizing they had deliberately stolen my final goodbye just to secure their wealth. I thought about the fake receipt Harper tried to trick me into signing at the dive bar. I thought about the relentless character assassination they funded in the orphan's court, trying to brand me a manipulative predator while they drank Aperol spritzes on the beach. They did not just make a mistake. They executed a calculated, ruthless strategy to destroy me, and they were only apologizing because the strategy failed. "I love you, Dad," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I am so sorry you are in this position." "Then help us," he pleaded. "I cannot," I sobbed, the tears flowing freely now. "I cannot fix this for you. Aria, please, you let her hide the funeral." "Dad," I cried, the old grief flaring up with devastating intensity. "You stood there and let her do it, because it was easier for you. You let them try to frame me for perjury. You did not protect me when I needed you. And now you want me to protect you from the consequences of your own greed." The line went silent. Richard had no defense. The truth was absolute and damning. "I am not revoking the notice," I said, my voice shaking violently. "You have 60 days. Please do not call me again." I hung up the phone and threw it onto the couch. I collapsed against the kitchen counter, sliding down to the floor, pulling my knees tightly against my chest. I wept until my throat felt raw and my eyes burned. The guilt was suffocating. I felt like a monster. I felt cold, cruel, and vindictive. I was legally evicting my aging parents, knowing they were financially ruined. I paced the narrow hallway of my apartment, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold a glass of water. Was I becoming just as ruthless as Diane? Was enforcing this boundary turning me into the exact kind of toxic abuser I had spent my entire life trying to escape? Setting boundaries with toxic family members rarely looks like a triumphant cinematic victory. It often feels like you are the villain. It feels like you are actively choosing to inflict pain on people you fundamentally love simply to survive them. Have you ever had to enforce a consequence that broke your own heart? Have you ever set a boundary that made you feel like the bad guy, even when you knew it was the only way to protect yourself? I sat on my cheap, sagging couch staring at the blank television screen. I had the money. I had the legal victory. But the next 60 days were going to be a grueling psychological nightmare, and I had to endure it completely alone. The 60 days did not pass quickly. They dragged on with a grueling, excruciating slowness, each day feeling heavier than the last. I threw myself entirely into my fieldwork, spending long, exhausting hours tracking algae blooms on the Chesapeake Bay, desperate to keep my mind occupied. The physical labor of wading through the marshes offered a temporary numbing relief, but the moment I returned to my cramped apartment, the heavy silence would settle over me again, bringing the suffocating guilt crashing back. Harrison Belmont managed all communication with my parents. I refused to answer their calls, blocking both their numbers and Harper's on my phone. Belmont forwarded me brief clinical updates regarding their progress. They were not contesting the notice. The crushing weight of the court-mandated legal fees had entirely broken their will to fight. Diane's high-priced attorneys had formally withdrawn their representation, refusing to hemorrhage any more billable hours on a lost cause. My parents were preparing to leave. It was a Tuesday evening, exactly 58 days into the notice period. A relentless, freezing autumn rain was falling over Maryland, turning the roads slick and reflective under the streetlights. I had just finished a 12-hour shift on the water, my muscles aching, my clothes smelling faintly of brackish mud. I was supposed to drive straight home, but a masochistic impulse seized control of my steering wheel. I turned down Route 50, heading toward the historic district of Annapolis. I told myself I just needed to verify they were actually moving, that Belmont was not simply telling me what I wanted to hear. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was drawn to the wreckage I had created. I pulled my battered Subaru onto their affluent tree-lined street and parked half a block away, cutting the headlights. The heavy rain obscured the windshield, but the scene unfolding across the street was unmistakable. A large, battered U-Haul truck was parked awkwardly in the circular driveway, its hazard lights blinking rhythmically, casting an eerie amber glow over the wet pavement. This was not a premium white-glove moving service, the kind Diane usually hired to ensure her neighbors saw her status. This was a desperate budget rental operation. I rolled down my window slightly, the cold, damp air rushing into the car, carrying the sounds of the struggle. Diane stood on the front porch, wrapped in a heavy trench coat, attempting to hold an umbrella over a large, ornate antique chair that two exhausted-looking movers were struggling to maneuver down the wet brick steps. Her voice cut through the rain, sharp and frantic. "Be careful with the upholstery!" Diane shrieked, batting her umbrella dangerously close to the movers' faces. "That is genuine French silk. If you ruin that chair, you will be paying for the restoration. Keep it covered." One of the movers slipped on the wet bricks, his knee buckling slightly. The chair tipped, scraping loudly against the iron handrail. Diane let out a shrill, horrified gasp, dropping the umbrella and rushing forward to inspect the damage, her pristine boots splashing into a muddy puddle at the base of the stairs. She looked frantic, terrified, and utterly diminished. the polished, formidable socialite who had hosted catered parties and commanded country club galas, was gone. She was desperately clutching the physical symbols of a wealth she could no longer afford, trying to save her armor as her world collapsed around her. My gaze shifted from my mother to the front door. My father emerged from the house carrying a large, heavy cardboard box sealed with cheap packing tape. The box looked unstable, buckling slightly under its own weight. Richard was not wearing his usual tailored suit or his expensive sailing gear. He wore a faded sweatshirt and baggy jeans. He looked incredibly old. His face was pale and drawn, his shoulders hunched under the physical strain. He took a slow, careful step onto the wet porch, his breathing visibly labored. He paused, leaning against a porch pillar, trying to shift his grip on the heavy box. He looked fragile, like a man whose internal foundation had completely crumbled. A sharp, agonizing pain spiked right behind my ribs. My hands flew to the door handle of the Subaru. My deeply ingrained instinct, conditioned over 29 years of being the reliable, practical daughter, screamed at me to jump out of the car. I needed to run across the street. I needed to grab that heavy box from his failing hands. I needed to usher my mother inside out of the freezing rain and tell her everything was going to be okay. I needed to fix this for them, just like I had fixed Harper's messes and accommodated Richard's cowardice my entire life. It would be so incredibly easy to open the car door. I could cross the street, pull out my checkbook, and stop their suffering. I could be the good daughter again. I could buy back their love. My fingers gripped the plastic door handle so tightly they went numb. The internal war was brutal, tearing me apart from the inside out. I was sobbing in the driver's seat, the tears blinding my vision, fighting a desperate battle against my own empathy. I watched my father take another shaky step down the stairs. The heavy box slipped slightly, and he grimaced in pain, his back clearly straining. "Please," I whispered to the empty car, my voice cracking in pure agony. "Please do not make me do this." But then I forced myself to remember. I forced myself to remember the searing pain of standing in the mud at the cemetery, realizing they had buried the only person who truly loved me without letting me say goodbye. I forced myself to remember the cold, calculating way Harper had tried to trick me into signing away my legal defense at the dive bar. I forced myself to remember the brutal deposition where Diane admitted she viewed me not as a daughter, but as a financial threat. If I opened that car door and ran across the street, I was not saving them. I was simply volunteering to be their victim again. I was offering myself up to be consumed by their bottomless greed and unhealed trauma. If I saved them now, they would never respect the boundary. They would take the money, secure their status, and instantly return to treating me like an invisible burden. I had to let them fall. I had to let them hit the bottom, because protecting my own survival meant allowing them to face the consequences of their own cruelty. I pulled my hand away from the door handle. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles aching, my chest heaving with ragged, heavy sobs. I was mourning the parents they could have been grieving, the supportive, loving family I had spent my entire life desperately hoping would eventually materialize. I watched my mother yell at the movers again, frantically wiping rain off the antique chair. I watched my father finally heave the heavy box into the back of the rented U-Haul, collapsing against the metal side panel in sheer exhaustion. They were packing up their ruined lives entirely alone. I shifted the Subaru into drive. I did not turn the headlights on until I was a full block away, terrified they might look up and see me watching them drown. I drove back to my apartment with the rain pounding against the windshield, crying so hard I had to pull over twice just to catch my breath. Enforcing the boundary did not feel victorious. It felt like tearing off a limb to escape a trap. I had survived the packing phase, but the final definitive severance was still waiting for me. And the confrontation would happen on the exact same spot where the war began. The 60-day deadline expired on a Thursday morning. The sky over Annapolis was overcast, casting a flat gray light that perfectly matched the heavy dread sitting in my stomach. I drove to the historic colonial estate, no longer speeding in a blind panic, but moving with a slow, reluctant dread. The legal war was officially over, and today was the execution of the final treaty. I parked my Subaru in the circular driveway. The sleek black Lexus and the silver Mercedes-Benz were gone, replaced by Harrison Belmont's practical sedan and a white panel van bearing the logo of a local locksmith company. I stepped out of the car, pulling my jacket tight against the brisk coastal wind. Belmont was waiting for me on the front porch, standing next to a burly man holding a metal toolbox. Belmont did not offer a celebratory smile. He understood the gravity of what we were about to do. He simply nodded, gestured for the locksmith to wait outside, and pushed the heavy mahogany front doors open. The immediate silence inside the house was jarring. I had only ever known this sprawling estate filled with the sounds of Diane's curated parties, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the low hum of expensive jazz playing through hidden speakers. Now the house was entirely hollow. The grand foyer, once dominated by a massive Persian rug and a gleaming antique console table, was stripped down to bare polished hardwood. My boots echoed loudly against the floorboards as I walked inside. The absence of furniture made the vaulted ceiling seem unnervingly high, creating a vast empty cavern that magnified every small sound. Diane and Richard were standing in the center of the empty foyer. They did not look like the formidable Annapolis power couple who had confidently hosted networking mixers and commanded country club galas. They looked diminished, stripped of their costly armor. Diane was not wearing a designer dress or her signature pearl necklace. She wore plain dark slacks and a simple gray sweater. Her face, usually immaculate and tightly controlled, was bare. Without her makeup, the deep lines around her mouth and eyes were starkly visible, revealing the physical toll the past few months had taken. Her eyes were red and puffy, her posture slumped, bearing the unmistakable exhaustion of a woman who had finally run out of options. Richard stood a few feet behind her, holding a single small cardboard box containing whatever final remnants they were taking with them. He refused to look at me. He kept his gaze firmly fixed on the floorboards, retreating into his default state of cowardice, unwilling to witness the emotional wreckage he had helped create. Belmont cleared his throat, breaking the heavy, suffocating silence. "Mr. and Mrs. Evans," he stated, his voice strictly professional, maintaining a clinical distance. "Today is the final day of the 60-day notice period. The locksmith is waiting outside to secure the premises. I need to verify that all personal property has been removed and that you are officially surrendering the keys." Diane did not acknowledge Belmont. She kept her red, puffy eyes locked entirely on me. There was no sudden explosion of rage. She did not point her finger, scream obscenities, or launch into a vicious character assassination. The frantic, desperate energy she had displayed during the caveat trial and the moving process was completely gone. The fight had been entirely drained out of her. Diane took a slow, halting step forward. The sound of her shoes scraping against the bare hardwood echoed through the empty foyer. She looked at me, and the expression on her face was not hatred. It was a profound, broken sadness. It was the look of a mother who had gambled everything on a toxic strategy and lost catastrophically. "You took everything," Diane whispered. Her voice was incredibly quiet, hollowed out, carrying a raw, agonizing devastation that sliced right through my chest. The words did not sound like an accusation. They sounded like a tragic, terrifying realization. She was not just mourning the loss of the multi-million-dollar estate. She was mourning the permanent loss of her social status, the destruction of her financial security, and the terrifying return to the poverty she had spent her entire life outrunning. The agonizing pain spiked behind my ribs again, squeezing my lungs until it was hard to breathe. The fierce boundary I had built over the last 2 months threatened to crack under the weight of her hollow whisper. My deeply ingrained instinct to apologize, to absorb the blame, and to offer her a lifeline flared up instantly. I gripped the hem of my jacket, my knuckles turning white. I forced myself to remember the truth. I forced myself to remember the muddy cemetery and the fake receipt. My chest heaved. A hot tear spilled over my lashes, tracing a slow line down my cheek. I did not wipe it away. I just took what she gave me. "Mom," I replied. My voice cracked thick with the overwhelming grief of the moment. "You threw me away long before this." Diane stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. She did not argue. She did not offer a tearful apology or a desperate plea for forgiveness. She knew the bridge was permanently burned. The absolute finality of my words hung heavily in the cold, empty air of the foyer. Diane reached into the pocket of her gray sweater. She pulled out a heavy brass key and held it out toward me. Her hand was trembling slightly. I did not step forward to take it. Belmont smoothly intercepted the gesture, plucking the key from her palm and dropping it into his briefcase with a soft thud. Diane lowered her empty hand. She turned around slowly, her shoulders sagging under the immense weight of her ruined life. She did not look back. She walked toward the open front door, her footsteps echoing one last time across the bare hardwood floors. Richard followed her, clutching the small cardboard box to his chest. He passed by me without a single word, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the doorway, escaping the confrontation exactly as he had always done. I stood frozen in the center of the foyer, watching them walk out onto the front porch and down the brick steps. They climbed into a modest rental car parked at the end of the driveway, the engine sputtering slightly as it started. They drove away, disappearing down the affluent tree-lined street, banished from the world they had worshipped. There was no cinematic swelling music. There was no triumphant feeling of vindication or powerful sense of closure. The villain was not vanquished in a blaze of glory. It was just an agonizingly painful, quiet end to a family that had destroyed itself through greed and cowardice. Belmont walked to the front door and gestured for the locksmith waiting outside. The burly man stepped into the foyer, dropping his heavy metal toolbox onto the floorboards with a loud, jarring clatter. He immediately went to work on the heavy mahogany doors. I stood in the silence, listening to the metallic grinding of the drill and the scrape of screws being removed. Belmont stood a respectful distance away, giving me the space to process the overwhelming reality of the severance. 10 minutes later, the locksmith stepped back, wiping his hands on his pants. He turned the heavy brass knob on the new deadbolt. The heavy metal mechanism engaged, sliding into the doorframe with a loud final click. The lock was changed. The boundary was sealed. They were officially gone. I stared at the closed mahogany door. The legal war was completely finished, the financial anxiety was erased, and the toxic family dynamic had been permanently severed. But as I turned away from the door and looked into the vast, echoing expanse of the empty colonial mansion, the reality of what I was left with began to settle in. I had won the estate, but navigating the physical and emotional remnants of Helen's legacy was a battle I still had to face. The loud final click of the new deadbolt echoed through the empty foyer, a sharp metallic punctuation mark signaling the absolute end. Belmont exchanged a few quiet words with the locksmith, handed him a check, and thanked him for his prompt service. The burly man packed up his tools and let himself out the back service entrance. Belmont turned to me holding a brand new set of brass keys dangling from a simple metal ring. He did not offer a congratulatory speech. He understood that handing over these keys felt less like transferring a prize and more like passing a heavy burden. "They are yours," Aria Belmont said quietly, dropping the keys into my open palm. "The property is legally secured. The trust funds are fully transferred. My firm will handle the final tax filings for the estate, but the heavy lifting is done. You have sole authority now." I closed my hand around the cold metal keys. The sharp edges pressed into my palm, a grounding physical sensation amidst the surreal emptiness of the house. "Thank you, Mr. Belmont," I replied, my voice raspy and exhausted. "For everything. For not letting me surrender when I wanted to." Belmont nodded slowly. "Helen knew you were capable of this, Aria. She just forced you to prove it to yourself. I will leave you to it. Call my office next week if you need to discuss the liquidation process." He turned and walked out the front door, the heavy mahogany shutting behind him with a solid thud. I was utterly alone. The sprawling Annapolis estate, a multi-million-dollar property sitting on pristine waterfront acreage, was entirely mine. For decades, this house had been the epicenter of Diane's curated social empire. Every room had been meticulously designed to project wealth and status, filled with imported rugs, antique furniture, and crystal chandeliers. Now stripped of Diane's expensive armor, the house looked vastly different. It was just a massive empty shell of drywall hardwood floors and expansive windows. The silence inside was absolute and unnerving. There was no background hum of jazz music, no clinking of wine glasses, no sharp, frantic voices arguing over credit card debt or social standing. I began to walk slowly through the echoing rooms. I passed through the formal dining room where Belmont had read the will, where Diane had swiped the copy of Silent Spring off the table in a blind rage. The mahogany table was gone, leaving only pale rectangular indentations indented into the carpet pad, where the heavy legs had rested for 20 years. I walked past the grand staircase, leading to the second floor, the same staircase Richard had labored down, carrying his heavy cardboard box, just a few days prior. The visual memory of his frail, struggling posture flared up, sending a quick, sharp pang of guilt through my chest. I pushed the feeling away, forcing myself to keep moving. I navigated the sprawling layout until I reached the back of the estate. I pushed open a set of French doors and stepped into what used to be Grandma Helen's sunroom. This room was different from the rest of the house. Diane had largely ignored it during her aggressive redecorating campaigns, deeming it too rustic and disconnected from the formal, entertaining spaces. Helen had claimed it entirely as her own. It featured walls composed almost entirely of large bay windows, offering an unobstructed panoramic view of the Severn River. I walked to the center of the empty sunroom. The gray afternoon light filtered through the glass, casting long, muted shadows across the bare floorboards. Outside, the wind was picking up, churning the dark water of the river into choppy, white-capped waves. A lone sailboat struggled against the current in the distance, a tiny speck of white against the sprawling gray canvas of the bay. I stood there looking out at the water, and the immense weight of the last 4 months finally crashed down on me. The financial reality was secure. The high-interest bridge loan was paid off. The staggering legal fees Sterling had racked up were now Diane's problem. The millions sitting in the trust accounts guaranteed I would never have to worry about rent, student loans, or buying cheap groceries ever again. But the security felt entirely disconnected from the emotional reality. The money sitting in a bank ledger did not magically repair the deep psychological wounds inflicted during the caveat trial. The certified deed to a mansion did not erase the traumatic memory of Harper trying to trick me into signing away my legal defense at a dive bar. I felt incredibly hollowed out. I walked slowly toward the large bay windows, my boots squeaking faintly against the hardwood. I knelt down beside the low windowsill, resting my forearms against the cool painted wood. I leaned my forehead against the glass, watching the turbulent river water smash against the wooden pilings of the private dock. As I shifted my weight, my eye caught a small imperfection in the woodwork of the windowsill. I leaned back, squinting in the dim light. I reached out, brushing my thumb over the painted surface. Buried under a layer of dust and a sloppy coat of white paint Diane had applied years ago was a small, shallow etching carved directly into the wood. It was a tiny, clumsy inscription, H+A. My breath caught in my throat. The memory flooded back with startling clarity. I was 10 years old. Diane had banished me to the sunroom during one of her fancy catered luncheons, furious because I had refused to wear a scratchy tulle dress and instead opted for mud-stained denim overalls. I had been sitting exactly here crying, feeling isolated and unwanted. Helen had slipped away from the party, sneaking into the sunroom with a plate of stolen appetizers and a small silver pocket knife. She had sat on the floor next to me in her expensive silk blouse, ignoring the dirt on my clothes. She had pulled out the pocket knife and carefully carved our initials into the windowsill, telling me that no matter how many fancy parties Diane threw, this corner of the house belonged exclusively to us. I traced the faded letters with my fingernail, feeling the shallow grooves beneath the paint. The dam broke. For 4 months I had been operating in a state of sustained hypervigilance. I had been too busy fighting for my survival, too busy fending off character assassinations, perjury, and extortion to actually process the inciting incident that started the entire war. I had lost my grandmother. The agonizing, chaotic grief I had felt standing in the mud at the cemetery finally returned, but this time it was not immediately hijacked by rage or the sudden arrival of a legal battle. There were no lawyers demanding affidavits. There were no frantic phone calls from Harper. Diane was not screaming obscenities in the foyer. The house was completely silent, holding space for the mourning I had been denied. I slumped against the windowsill, pulling my knees to my chest, and I finally allowed myself to properly grieve. I cried softly, the tears spilling hot and fast down my cheeks, dripping onto the collar of my jacket. I wept for the woman who had bought me my first pair of waterproof field boots. I wept for the woman who had read Silent Spring with me and asked genuine questions about wetland ecology. I wept for the fierce, brilliant woman who had loved me enough to anticipate a legal war and build an ironclad defense to protect me from it. "Thank you, Grandma," I whispered into the empty room, my voice thick with sorrow. "Thank you for seeing me." I sat by the window for a long time, watching the gray light slowly fade into dusk over the Severn River. The tears eventually subsided, leaving behind a profound, heavy exhaustion. As the quiet settled around me, a sudden clarifying realization began to take shape. The millions sitting in the trust accounts did not magically fix my trauma. The deed to this massive historic estate did not erase the agonizing betrayal of my parents hiding the funeral. The inheritance was not a cure, but the fierce, brutal boundary I had fought for, the line I had drawn in the sand and defended with everything I had, finally gave me the physical and mental space I needed to start healing. By forcing them out, by refusing to absorb their financial ruin or tolerate their manipulation, I had permanently removed the source of the toxicity from my daily life. I was no longer playing defense. I was no longer waiting for the next explosive argument or the next desperate demand for money. I pushed myself up from the floor, my muscles stiff and aching. I looked around the empty sunroom one last time, tracing the faded H+A with my finger before turning away. I walked back through the hollow, echoing house, my footsteps steady and deliberate. I reached the front foyer, opened the heavy mahogany doors, and stepped out into the cool evening air. I pulled the door shut behind me, the new deadbolt engaging with a satisfying solid thud. I walked down the brick steps toward my battered Subaru, pulling my phone from my pocket. I opened a new message to Harrison Belmont. I had won the estate, but I knew exactly what I needed to do with it to truly sever the final ties to Diane's toxic legacy. The final move was not about revenge, but about building a future that honored the only person in this family who actually mattered. Spring on the Chesapeake Bay carries a distinct scent, a blend of salt-wet cordgrass and damp earth. I stood in the small galley kitchen of my new townhouse, pouring black coffee into a battered travel mug. The space was modest, barely 1,200 square feet. The countertops were basic laminate, and the hardwood floors creaked near the staircase. It was a fraction of the size of the Annapolis estate, yet it felt infinitely larger because the air inside belonged only to me. I never spent a single night in my grandmother's sprawling waterfront mansion. After the locksmith changed the deadbolts and Belmont handed me the keys, I walked back out to my car and drove away. The walls held too many ghosts. Every room echoed with decades of conditional affection and calculated social posturing. I did not want to sleep under the same roof where my mother had curated her high society illusions, or where my father had retreated into his comfortable cowardice. Harrison Belmont handled the real estate listing. A technology executive from Washington bought the property in cash, eager to tear down the historic sunroom to build a modern infinity pool. I signed the transfer papers without a shred of hesitation. Letting go of the house was the final necessary step in excising the toxicity from my daily orbit. But the vast wealth Helen left behind required a purpose. I refused to let the millions sit idle in an investment portfolio, accumulating interest, just to serve as a sterile trophy of my legal victory. I wanted the money to mean something. I wanted it to close the loop on the generational trauma that had fractured this family. I scheduled a final meeting with Belmont. We sat in his downtown office drafting the charter for a brand new conservation trust. I funded the project with the bulk of the liquid assets and the proceeds from the estate sale. I named it the Helen and Diane Estuary Foundation. The irony of the title was a deliberate choice, a permanent nod to the roots my mother had spent her entire adult life trying to eradicate. The Foundation's sole mission is to purchase, protect, and restore the working-class wetlands of the Maryland Eastern Shore. We fund grants to preserve the exact marshes where Diane grew up, the exact shallow waters where she once packed blue crabs on soggy newspapers, bleeding and terrified of poverty. Now the immense wealth she coveted, the fortune she committed perjury and destroyed her family to seize, operates as a permanent shield protecting the peasant environment she loathed. Every coastal grant we issue, every acre of muddy marshland we preserve from commercial development bears her name. It is a quiet, poetic justice. The money did not elevate her to the pinnacle of Annapolis society. It tethered her legacy permanently to the mud. The Foundation gave me a profound sense of closure, but creating it did not magically erase the underlying grief. Healing is not a cinematic montage that concludes with a flawless smile and a sudden erasure of pain. Healing is tedious. It involves waking up on a Tuesday morning, brushing your teeth, and suddenly remembering the smell of your mother's perfume, feeling a sharp ache in your chest before forcing yourself to move on with your day. The pain does not vanish. It just becomes a manageable resident in your mind, occupying less square footage as the months pass. I set my coffee mug down on the laminate counter. My phone buzzed against the formica surface, vibrating with a harsh mechanical hum. I had blocked Diane and Harper months ago. I had kept Richard's number unblocked, a lingering fragile tether to the man who used to teach me how to tie sailing knots before he decided keeping his wife happy was more important than protecting his daughter. I picked up the device and tapped the screen. A new text message from Richard glowed against the glass. Your mother and I are renting a small apartment in Baltimore. It is an adjustment. We are managing. I stared at the two short sentences. They carried a heavy, tragic weight. Baltimore is an hour away from Annapolis, but in social currency, it is an entirely different universe. Renting a small apartment meant their credit was still decimated from the court-mandated legal fees. They had lost the country club memberships, the catered parties, the sprawling waterfront views. We are managing. It was the most honest admission my father had ever made. He did not ask for money. He did not hurl an accusation. He just offered a bleak status update from a man who had lost his kingdom. My thumbs hovered over the digital keyboard, the deeply ingrained reflex to fix their pain. The role I had played since childhood flared to life. I started typing. Dad, I am so sorry things ended up this way. I think about you and Mom every day. I just could not let her destroy Grandma's legacy. If you need anything practical, I can try to help. Maybe we can get coffee sometime. I poured my messy, conflicting emotions into a long, sprawling paragraph. I wanted to explain my choices. I wanted him to validate my pain. I wanted to bridge the vast chasm between us and find some sliver of the father I used to idolize. I read the drafted paragraph twice. Then I paused. Sending that message would be opening a door to a burning building, offering assistance, offering coffee, offering emotional vulnerability. It would invite the chaos right back into my quiet townhouse. Diane would view the olive branch as an opening to ask for a loan. Harper would inevitably follow armed with a new crisis. The cycle of manipulation, guilt, and resentment would restart, threatening the fragile peace I had fought so brutally to secure. Understanding their pain did not mean I had to invite them back to my table. Forgiving them internally did not require an external reconciliation. The boundary was the only thing keeping me safe. I held down the backspace key. I watched the long, emotional paragraph disappear, letter by letter, erasing my vulnerability until the text field was completely blank. I took a slow, deep breath, steadying my hands. I typed 2 brief sentences. Glad to hear you are safe. Take care. I pressed send. There was no immediate reply. I did not wait for one. I flicked the small switch on the side of my phone, setting the device to silent. I slipped it into the front pocket of my canvas field jacket. I walked into the narrow mudroom by the front door. Sitting on the rubber mat was my battered pair of neoprene chest waders, caked with dry gray clay from yesterday's marsh survey. I pulled them on the thick material familiar and comforting against my legs. I laced up my heavy waterproof boots, pulling the knots tight. I grabbed my clipboard and my water testing kits from the small wooden bench. I opened the front door and stepped out into the crisp spring morning. The coastal breeze hit my face, carrying the briny scent of the Chesapeake Bay. The morning sun was burning off the early fog, casting a warm golden light over the pavement. The trauma of the past year still lingered, a faint, dull ache tucked away in the back of my mind. The betrayal of my family is a scar I will carry for the rest of my life. But as I walked toward my car, listening to the crunch of my heavy boots against the gravel driveway, I realized the heavy, suffocating weight was finally gone. I was heading to the water, to the mud, to the scientific work my grandmother had always championed. I was alone, but I was secure. The legal war was over, the foundation was established, and the boundary was permanently set. I was finally free. I stand by the edge of the bay, watching the tide pull back from the thick green marsh grass. The water here is murky, unpredictable, and undeniably real. It is a long way from the manicured lawns of the Annapolis Cemetery, where this nightmare began. Looking back at the brutal legal battles, the shattered illusions, and the quiet, empty mansion, I realize the hardest part of surviving a toxic family is not the initial explosion. It is the quiet aftermath when you are left alone, forced to figure out who you are without their heavy expectations weighing you down. I did not walk away from this war unscathed. I carry scars that will ache whenever the weather changes. But I also walked away with a clarity I never possessed before. If you are sitting in the dark right now, wondering how to survive the people who are supposed to protect you, I want to share the 5 truths that kept me alive. First, setting a boundary will always feel like a betrayal to the people who profit from your lack of one. When I served my parents the eviction notice, the guilt twisted my stomach into knots. I felt like a villain. But I was not acting out of cruelty. I was finally acting out of necessary self-preservation. Second, understanding someone's trauma does not obligate you to absorb their toxicity. During that deposition, I saw the terrified little girl inside my mother, running from the grinding poverty of her youth. I felt deep, agonizing pity for her. But pity is not a suicide pact. You can understand a person's pain while keeping your front door firmly locked. Third, true power does not roar. It documents. My mother and sister relied on shouting social pressure and frantic emotional manipulation. My grandmother relied on a hidden video file, a clear mind, and an airtight legal trust. The truth never needs to shout to win the war. Fourth, grief and freedom can coexist in the exact same space. You will mourn the loving family you always deserved while simultaneously celebrating the peace you finally secured. Let yourself feel both. The sadness does not mean you made the wrong choice. It just means you have a functioning heart. Fifth, and most importantly, your worth is never determined by the people who refuse to see it. My parents looked at my career and saw a muddy disappointment. Grandma Helen looked at me and saw a fierce, enduring legacy. But in the end, the only vision that actually matters is your own. The sun is fully up now, turning the choppy surface of the Chesapeake Bay into a sheet of hammered gold. I pull my waterproof notebook from my jacket and step into the shallow water. My boots sink into the familiar clay. I am getting my hands dirty just the way my grandmother taught me, building a reality that is entirely mine. I am Aria, and I am no longer a background character in someone else's tragedy. If my journey resonated with you today, I want you to know that you possess the strength to write your own ending. You do not have to accept the role they assigned you. Please take a second to hit the like button and subscribe to Olivia Stories Revenge. Building a community of survivors is how we remind each other that walking away is a hard-earned victory. Leave a comment below and tell me which of the 5 lessons hit closest to home for you. I read every single one. Thank you for listening, and please always remember to protect your peace.